The light comes first, not sudden, not dramatic, but gradual. The way dawn has always arrived on the Bay of Naples. It filters through a thin veil of volcanic haze that hangs perpetually over the region, turning the early morning sun into something softer, almost pale gold. The kind of light that doesn't wake you harshly, but pulls you gently from sleep. By the time the sun clears the eastern hills, Pompeii is already stirring. Somewhere in the narrow streets, a cartwheel strikes stone. The sound echoes off plastered walls, sharp and familiar, then another and another. The rhythm of morning commerce beginning. Wooden shutters scrape open along the Via dell'Abbondanza. A woman's voice calls out to someone 2 buildings down. Something about yesterday's delivery, something mundane and forgettable. The kind of conversation that happens every morning in every city that has ever existed. From the bakeries, the smell of bread. It mingles with salt air drifting in from the coast, 6 blocks away. If you stood on certain rooftops, you could see the water flat and blue stretching toward Capri. But most people in Pompeii aren't looking at views. They're opening shops, lighting fires, carrying amphorae of water from the public fountains, balanced on shoulders, moving with the practiced ease of people who've done this 1,000 times before. The city holds roughly 20,000 souls. It is not Rome, not even close, but it is prosperous. Important enough: wool trade, wine export, fish sauce production. The kind of city where money moves but nobody gets too famous, where life happens at a scale you can comprehend. You could walk from one end to the other in less than half an hour, and by the end of that walk you'd have passed 3 temples, a theatre, 2 bathhouses, and more shops than you could count. In 48 hours this morning routine would be frozen in volcanic ash, but nobody knew that yet. The hammers start around the same time the bread smell peaks. Metal workers in their small workshops, shaping bronze and iron. The sound is rhythmic, almost musical if you've heard it enough times. 3 strikes, pause. 2 strikes, pause. The pattern of repair and creation, the background percussion of urban life. A blacksmith's apprentice, maybe 14 years old, pumps a bellows, sweat already on his forehead despite the early hour. He'll do this until midday, then again after the afternoon rest, then into evening. Tomorrow he'll do it again. Election slogans cover the walls in red and black paint. Vote for Gaius. The fruit sellers support Marcus for Edile. Elect Lucius, he'll fix the roads. Democracy, Roman style, loud and public and painted everywhere you look. Some of the slogans are weeks old, already fading. Some are fresh, probably painted the night before by enthusiastic supporters or hired advertisers. The words overlap, fight for space, creating a visual cacophony that somehow becomes invisible when you see it every single day. A water carrier sets down his amphora to adjust the rope cutting into his shoulder. His route takes him to 12 houses. Same houses every morning, same payment at the end of each week. He knows which matrons will offer him watered wine in the heat of afternoon and which ones close the door without a word. He knows the stairs that creak and which courtyards have aggressive dogs. Knowledge built from repetition, the invisible architecture of routine. The commercial district sits on the eastern side, where different trades have clustered over generations, not by law, but by logic. Bakers near grain storage, metal workers near each other because they share suppliers, cloth merchants where foot traffic is heaviest, and in one particular corner where water access is good and ventilation matters, a specific kind of workshop, the kind where transformation happens, where something dirty becomes clean, where an entire trade exists that most people prefer not to think about too carefully, even as they depend on it completely. The morning continues, ordinary and unremarkable, following patterns worn smooth by time. Cities organize themselves, not through grand planning, but through the accumulated logic of hundreds of small decisions made over generations. In Pompeii, if you needed bread, you went to a street where 5 bakeries competed within 100 paces of each other. If you needed metalwork, you walked to where the sound of hammers told you exactly where to go before you could even see the workshops. This clustering wasn't accidental. Bakers located near bakers because they shared grain suppliers. A merchant arriving with cartloads of wheat could make all his deliveries in one district, in one morning. Bakers also shared knowledge, the temperature of the best ovens, the timing of fermentation, the particular supplier who sold yeast cultures that produced the lightest loaves. Competition existed, certainly, but so did a kind of professional kinship. They spoke the same language, understood the same problems, attended the same guild meetings where they negotiated prices and settled disputes. The metal workers clustered for similar reasons, but also because noise attracts noise. The constant percussion of hammer on anvil, the roar of bellows, fed fires, the hiss of hot bronze meeting water, these sounds marked territory. Residential neighbours complained less when all the noise happened in one district, and metalworkers needed each other. A blacksmith might send a customer to the coppersmith next door. The coppersmith might borrow tools from the bronze specialist across the street. Infrastructure mattered too. Metalwork requires water for cooling and fire suppression. Building a system of channels and drains made sense when 5 workshops could share the cost, instead of one bearing it alone. Walk through these commercial districts, and you could navigate by scent alone. Bakeries announced themselves through bread and smoke. Garum workshops, where fish sauce fermented in enormous vats, produced a smell so distinctive that residents either loved it as the scent of prosperity or hated it as a necessary evil. Leather tanners worked on the city's outskirts for obvious reasons. The chemicals they used to cure hides created odours that democracy couldn't tolerate, no matter how much the city needed shoes and armour and saddles. But one district attracted particular attention, or perhaps, more accurately, particular avoidance, where the cloth trades gathered. This area made sense for the same practical reasons as the others. Weavers needed to be near wool suppliers. Dyers needed proximity to shops that sold their finished cloth. And the finishers, the ones who took rough, greasy fabric and transformed it into something wearable. They needed more than proximity. They needed water, lots of it, and drainage, and ventilation that only an open courtyard could provide. The architecture of commerce followed patterns refined over centuries. Ground floors opened wide to the street. No glass, no doors during business hours, just a broad threshold where customers could stand and watch work happening in real time. Trust was built through visibility. You could see the baker kneading dough, watch the metal worker shaping iron, observe quality being created before your eyes. Above these open workspaces, living quarters, the owner's family maybe, or workers if they were slaves or apprentices who lived where they laboured. Some buildings had small courtyards in back, precious open space in a dense city, used for storage, for animals, for anything that needed air and light. Stone and plaster defined the aesthetic, painted frescoes on walls that could afford them, simple whitewash on those that couldn't. Wooden shutters that swung open each dawn, closed each dusk, their hinges worn smooth from years of the same motion. Roof tiles that channeled rain into cisterns because water was valuable, even in a city connected to an aqueduct. One particular trade required something most Romans would never touch: human urine, collected fresh every morning from public urinals. This is where our story narrows its focus, to a corner where cloth was transformed, where wool arrived filthy and left pristine, where an entire economy revolved around getting things clean. On a corner lot in Region I, where 2 streets intersected and traffic flowed steady throughout the day, stood a building that told 2 stories. The first story was visible in its bones: the layout of rooms, the quality of remaining frescoes, the size of the atrium. This had once been a home for someone wealthy. The kind of residence that announced status simply by existing. But the second story was written in modification, in the sunken vats, set into what had been an elegant courtyard floor, in the drainage channels cut through marble, in the smell that no amount of wealth could have tolerated in a private residence. This was the Fullonica of Stephanus. The name survived on inscriptions, painted endorsements on nearby walls, the kind of commercial presence that leaves traces. We know Stephanus owned this place. We know his business was successful enough to occupy a substantial property in a good location. We know he employed workers. Beyond that, Stephanus himself fades into the anonymity that claims most people who ever lived. But his building remains, or remained, perfectly preserved by the same disaster that erased everything else. The structure was larger than most commercial establishments. Converting an aristocratic house to industrial use provided space that purpose-built workshops couldn't match. The central courtyard, once a peaceful peristyle where a wealthy family took evening air, now served as the heart of operations. Open to sky, surrounded by columns that remembered their former elegance, the courtyard had been radically transformed. 5 large vats were sunk into the ground, each deep enough that a man standing inside would find the liquid reaching his waist. These weren't decorative. The stone showed wear patterns. Specific spots where feet had stood, repeatedly wearing depressions into surfaces that should have been permanent. Around the courtyard's perimeter, basins for rinsing, some built into the walls, others freestanding, an entire infrastructure of water management, channels for bringing it in, drains for taking it away. Romans understood hydraulics the way we understand electricity, necessary, mostly invisible, and absolutely essential for the systems that made urban life possible. In one section, pressing equipment, heavy wooden frames with mechanisms for applying even pressure across broad surfaces. In another area, evidence of storage, amphorae that once held particular substances, some mundane, some strange clay vessels marked with symbols that workers would have recognized instantly. This one holds full as earth, that one holds something else, something collected from public facilities around the city, something we'll discuss when the time is right. 7 people worked here every day, performing tasks that would seem strange, disgusting, and surprisingly complex to modern sensibilities. Living quarters occupied the upper floor. Probably workers lived there. Possibly Stephanus himself, though successful owners often maintained separate, more pleasant residences. The rooms were modest but functional. Places to sleep between shifts. Places to eat simple meals. Places to exist in those hours when you weren't working, though those hours were few. The building's position spoke to commercial acumen. Corner lot meant visibility from 2 directions. Location in a commercial district meant appropriate context. Nobody complained about industrial noise when every building around you was similarly engaged. Proximity to main streets meant customer access. Every detail of this place, from its conversion to its operation, reflected decisions made for business reasons. Stephanus wasn't preserving an architectural treasure. He was making money, and the way he made money was through transformation, taking things that were one way dirty, stained, reeking of wear and human contact, and making them another way clean, bright, acceptable for public display. It was alchemy of a sort, though the Romans had no such word. It was chemistry, though they lacked that concept too. It was simply work, skilled, necessary, profitable work that someone had to do. And these 7 people did it every single day until the day nobody did it ever again. Clothing in the Roman world wasn't what we imagine when we think of fabric. No cotton, or almost none. It existed but remained exotic and expensive, imported from India in quantities too small to matter for everyday use. No synthetics, obviously. No elastic, no zippers, no Velcro, none of the invisible technologies that make modern dressing thoughtless. What Romans wore was primarily wool, some linen for undergarments and summer weight, both materials that behave in specific ways when they encounter water, oil, sweat, and time. The toga is the garment everyone recognizes, but few understand. It wasn't a robe, it was a single piece of fabric cut in a semicircle, measuring anywhere from 15 to 20 feet along its outer edge. Pure white wool for most citizens, with purple stripes for senators, different configurations indicating different ranks. Putting one on correctly required help and knowledge. The draping followed complex rules. Fabric over the left shoulder, wrapped around the back, pulled across the chest, draped over the left arm, with the remaining length hanging in precise folds that had to maintain their shape throughout the day. A properly maintained toga could cost as much as a labourer's yearly wages. Getting it professionally cleaned, that happened at least once a month. But togas weren't daily wear, they were formal attire. The clothing of public business, of appearing before magistrates, of religious ceremonies, of political life. Citizens wore them when citizenship needed to be visible. The rest of the time, which was most of the time, Romans wore tunics, simpler garments, essentially large shirts that fell to the knee for men, to the ankle for women. Still wool, usually still subject to the same problems. All clothing faces when humans wear it repeatedly. Wool absorbs, body oils migrate into fiber. Sweat leaves salt deposits. Street dirt and Roman streets produced a particular kind of grime from thousands of feet. Cartwheels, animal traffic, and the general accumulation of urban life worked itself into fabric with every wearing. Food stains, wine stains, oil from lamps, smudges from touching walls, the invisible residue of simply existing in a physical world. All of it accumulated in cloth that couldn't be casually washed, because wool, when aggressively cleaned with water, does something inconvenient. It shrinks, it felts, the fibers lock together, the garment becomes smaller, stiffer, unwearable. Modern wool garments carry warnings about this: dry clean only, or hand wash in cold water. Romans had discovered these same limitations through centuries of experience. You couldn't just soak a wool toga in water and expect it to survive. Yet clothing had to be clean, not for hygiene as we understand it, though Romans valued cleanliness, but for social reasons that mattered more than personal comfort. Your clothing announced your status. A dingy toga marked you as either poor or careless. A properly maintained white toga, brilliant, smooth, folded correctly, marked you as a citizen who understood social expectations and had the resources to meet them. In a culture where visual presentation communicated everything from political affiliation to moral character, dirty clothes weren't a minor embarrassment. They were a social failure. This is why fullers existed. This is why the Fullonica of Stephanus could occupy a valuable corner property. This is why 7 people worked there every day. The Fullonica wasn't simply where you took dirty clothes to be cleaned. That is the modern understanding, but it misses half the picture. Fullers served 2 distinct functions in the Roman textile economy, and both were essential. They finished new cloth fresh from the loom, and they maintained existing garments throughout their working lives. Without fullers, the clothing industry couldn't have functioned at all. When wool cloth came off a weaver's loom, it wasn't ready to wear. It was loose, almost fluffy in texture, greasy with lanolin, the natural oils in sheep's wool that protected the animal but made the fabric repellent to both water and dye. The weave was open, imprecise, prone to stretching and distorting. It needed transformation. Fullers provided that transformation through a series of processes we'd now call finishing. They scoured the fabric to remove oils, beat it, trampled it, worked it until the fibers locked together in a process called felting, stretched it on frames to set dimensions, raised the surface fibers with teasel plants, spiky seed heads that caught and lifted the nap without breaking it. Then sheared that raised nap to create a smooth, even surface. The result was fabric that looked and felt completely different from what went in. For existing garments, fullers offered what we might recognize as dry cleaning, though the methods bore no resemblance to modern chemical processes. Deep cleaning that removed accumulated oils and dirt without destroying the wool. Stain treatment using knowledge passed down through generations. This substance for wine, that one for blood, another for oil, each requiring different approaches. Rebrightening of whites which yellowed with age and wear. Restoration of dyed colours that faded under Mediterranean sun. This was skilled labour. A fuller needed to understand how different wools behaved, how much beating fabric could tolerate before damage, which cleaning agents worked for which problems, when to use heat and when cold water was essential, how long each process required. Too short and it failed, too long and you ruined expensive material. This knowledge wasn't written down in manuals. It lived in the bodies and minds of workers, transmitted through apprenticeship, refined through years of daily practice. The social position of fullers reflected Roman contradictions about necessary but unpleasant work. Fulling required handling substances that Romans categorized as polluting: human urine, collected from public latrines, sulfur, with its associations with the underworld. The work itself was physical, dirty, smelly. Literature mocked fullers. Graffiti made jokes. The stereotype of the fuller reeking of piss appears repeatedly in Roman sources. Yet fullers made money. Some, like Stephanus, made enough to own substantial properties and employ multiple workers. They organized into collegia, professional guilds that gave them collective voice and social identity. Their patron deity was Minerva, goddess of craft and wisdom, suggesting they saw their work as skilled rather than degraded. They participated in religious festivals, made public dedications, commissioned artwork. Romans joked about fullers smelling like piss and working in filth. Yet when election season came, fullers' endorsements appeared painted prominently on city walls. This contradiction, mockery and respect, pollution and profit, defined the fuller's position: essential but embarrassing, skilled but smelly, wealthy but never quite respectable. They inhabited a social space that made perfect economic sense while making no cultural sense at all. Step through the wide entrance on that corner lot, and you enter a space that remembers two lives. The threshold is broad, open during working hours, designed for visibility. Customers could stand here and observe work happening in real time. Potential clients could assess quality before committing their expensive garments. Workers knew they labored under public scrutiny, which enforced standards more effectively than any supervisor could. The entrance opens into what was once an atrium, the formal receiving area of a wealthy home. Some of that grandeur persists. The floor still shows traces of mosaic, though heavy use has worn it smooth in pathways. The walls retain painted plaster in sections, though replastered areas mark where water damage required practical repairs over aesthetic preservation. This tension between former elegance and current function defines the entire space. Beyond the atrium, the courtyard. Originally a peristyle, an open-air garden surrounded by columns where a prosperous family took leisure. Now the operational heart of the Fullonica, the columns remain, holding up covered walkways that protect workers from direct sun during the worst heat. But the courtyard floor tells a different story than the one it was built to tell. 5 large vats interrupt the ground level, not placed on top but sunk into it. The floor was excavated, cut down to accommodate terracotta vessels deep enough that a man could stand inside with water reaching his waist. Around each vat, the stone shows wear, specific depressions where feet stood repeatedly for years, the kind of erosion that happens slowly, invisibly, until one day you notice that stone has yielded to human persistence. In one corner of the courtyard, beneath a faded fresco of Venus admiring herself, 5 terracotta vats were sunk into the ground. This is where men stood waist deep, treading clothes for hours until their legs went numb. Rinsing basins line the courtyard's perimeter, some built into the covered walkways, others freestanding. All positioned with access to the water system, channels cut into existing architecture, leading from the city's aqueduct supply, terminating in drains that carry waste away. Romans understood that water must flow. Standing water breeds problems. Moving water solves them. One section of the complex housed pressing equipment. Heavy wooden frames, vertical construction, with mechanisms for tightening pressure evenly across broad surfaces. The wood showed the dark staining that comes from years of contact with damp fabric. Nearby, storage areas, amphoras stacked carefully, each marked or positioned to indicate contents. Some held fuller's earth, a fine clay essential to the cleaning process. Others held something more unusual, collected daily from public facilities around Pompeii, clay vessels of sulfur, yellow and pungent. Baskets of dried teasel plants, their spiky seed heads perfect for raising fabric nap. Overhead, across the courtyard, evidence of rope systems, attachments on columns where patterns on stone suggesting where lines were regularly tied. This was drying infrastructure. Cleaned garments would hang here, suspended in air, catching whatever breeze moved through the space. The upper floor remained largely unchanged from the building's original purpose. Living quarters, modest rooms where workers slept, ate, existed between shifts. Some of these rooms looked down into the courtyard through small windows, creating a strange dynamic where private and commercial space overlapped, where home was workplace and workplace was home. Every element served function, but beauty haunted the edges. Tools tell stories through their wear. In the Fullonica of Stephanus, the implements of labour were simple enough to catalogue in minutes, yet complex enough in their use to require years of learning. Start with the wooden bats, not large, perhaps the length of a forearm, shaped like elongated paddles with handles worn smooth from thousands of grips. used for beating fabric not violently but rhythmically, systematically, working cleaning solutions through wool fibers or pressing water from rinsed garments. The wood was dense, probably oak or similar hardwood, oiled regularly to prevent splitting. Years of use darkened the striking surfaces, gave them a burnished quality that new wood never possesses. Earthenware basins in various sizes, some small enough to hold with both hands, used for mixing cleaning compounds or treating individual stains. Others large enough that you'd need to bend over them, designed for rinsing substantial pieces of fabric. The clay was thick, sturdy, but not indestructible. Cracks appeared over time, sometimes patched with lead or pitch, sometimes simply worked around. Romans wasted nothing. A basin with a small crack could still serve for years if positioned correctly, if you understood its weakness and accommodated it. Storage vessels for cleaning agents, amphoras for liquids, sealed with cork or clay stoppers. Some marked with symbols workers would recognize. This one holds the liquid collected from public facilities. That one holds water mixed with fuller's earth. Clay containers for sulfur, kept sealed because the substance degraded in moisture. Wooden boxes for dried teasel plants, their spiky seed heads preserved carefully because they were seasonal and valuable. The teasel plants themselves deserve attention. Natural tools grown specifically for textile work. Their hooked spines caught and lifted surface fibers without tearing the underlying weave, something even carefully designed bronze tools couldn't quite replicate, though some fullers used metal alternatives. Dragged across finished fabric at the correct angle, with the correct pressure, teasels raised the nap that gave high-quality wool its characteristic texture, shears for cutting that raised nap to uniform height. Iron blades requiring regular sharpening, developing specific wear patterns where the fuller's thumb pressed during use. The handles were simple loops, sometimes wrapped with leather for comfort. These shears had to be sharp enough to cut wool fibers cleanly without crushing them, which meant maintenance was constant. A dull blade ruined work pressing boards and frames. Heavy wooden construction, mechanisms that modern woodworkers would recognize, threaded screws for applying pressure, crossbeams for distributing force evenly. The wood showed watermarks, staining from years of contact with damp fabric. Some pieces had been repaired, reinforced where stress caused splitting. Stretching frames for setting fabric dimensions after cleaning and before pressing. Adjustable with pegs or hooks around the perimeter where cloth could be attached and pulled to precise measurements. The frames had to be sturdy enough to handle significant tension without warping. The most important tool in a Fullonica wasn't a tool at all. It was the human foot, toothed, strong, and tireless in its treading. None of these implements required complex manufacturing. A competent craftsman could produce them all. What required complexity was knowing how to use them, when to beat and when to press. How much pressure, how long, in what sequence. The tools were simple, the knowledge was not. Behind every bat and basin and blade were the people who wielded them daily. A Fullonica's workforce was a microcosm of Roman society, its hierarchies, its economic realities, its quiet contradictions. The work was constant, physical, and essential, but how it was distributed among the people who labored there revealed the structure of ancient production. At the top of the Fullonica stood the owner, Stephanus, whose name survives in faded inscriptions on Pompeii's walls. Yet Stephanus himself likely did not tread in the vats or beat garments into submission with wooden bats. His role was managerial, economic. He oversaw operations, ensured profits, and occasionally made appearances to maintain order or negotiate with important clients. His hands were probably clean. His wealth depended on the labor of others. Beneath him was the foreman, the practical authority within the Fullonica. The foreman was the one who maintained the daily rhythm of work, assigning tasks, inspecting progress, and settling disputes. He might also handle customer interactions, negotiating fees and deadlines. A good foreman needed experience, a sharp eye for quality, and the respect of the workers. He was the bridge between Stephanus's ambitions and the reality of the labor required to meet them. The majority of the workforce, however, consisted of slaves. This was the foundation of Roman industry, an unflinching reality of the ancient world. These men were not here by choice. They came from many places, prisoners of war, the children of slaves, or individuals sold into servitude by misfortune or debt. Their labor was not compensated, and yet their skill was invaluable. A trained slave who understood the intricacies of wool, the chemistry of cleaning agents, and the rhythms of treading was as essential to the Fullonica's success as the vats or basins. Among the slaves there were distinctions. Older, more experienced slaves, those who had spent years in the trade, might hold a certain status within the workshop. They trained newcomers, corrected mistakes, and ensured that the work met the foreman's standards. Their expertise gave them a degree of authority, even if their freedom was non-existent. In some cases, freedmen, liberty, worked alongside the enslaved. These were men who had purchased or been granted their freedom, but remained tied to their former master's household or business. For many freedmen, staying in the trade they knew was a practical choice. They were no longer bound by law, but their dependence on the Fullonica for income and stability kept them within its walls. Their presence blurred the line between free and enslaved, a reminder of Rome's complex social fabric. Occasionally, free-born poor citizens joined the workforce. For them, working in a Fullonica was a last resort, a way to survive when other opportunities failed. The work was grueling and carried the stigma of dealing with polluting substances like urine and sulfur. But for those without land connections or other means of support, it was better than starvation. The workforce was also diverse in age. Boys in their early teens might begin as apprentices, fetching water, preparing cleaning solutions, or helping with lighter tasks. Their days were spent observing and learning, their futures tied to the skills they absorbed. Most workers, however, were men in their physical prime, their 20s to 40s, capable of enduring the intense physical demands of the trade. Strong legs were essential for treading, which required hours of repetitive stepping in vats of liquid. Stamina was a necessity, as was the ability to lift and carry waterlogged wool, which became unbearably heavy when soaked. By their 30s, the toll of the work was evident. Many fullers could no longer straighten their backs fully, their spines bent from years of bending over basins and hauling fabric. Their feet, tools as much as body parts, were thick with calluses, their toes splayed wide from gripping slippery surfaces. Hands bore the marks of labor, cracked skin from constant exposure to chemicals, calluses where wooden tools pressed against flesh, and scars from accidents with shears or pressing equipment. Some of these men had been doing this work since childhood, and their bodies carried the story of their trade. This was a world of men. Unlike weaving, which often employed women, fulling required brute strength and endurance. Together, these workers, slaves, freedmen, and occasionally free citizens kept the Fullonica running, their labor transforming dirty, stained fabric into garments fit for public life. Having met the people behind the work, we now follow them into the Fullonica itself, where the rhythm of their day began at dawn, with the first tasks of the morning unfolding in the cool, quiet hours. In Pompeii, dawn doesn't arrive suddenly, it creeps in. The first hint of light softens the edges of the night, turning the dark streets into muted shades of grey. The air is cool, almost damp, carrying the faint tang of salt from the sea. The city, still quiet, begins to stir, the first echoes of footsteps on stone breaking the stillness. These are the footsteps of workers moving toward their trades, their tread unhurried yet steady. Among them are the men of the Fullonica, their day beginning not with sunlight but with tasks as familiar as their own breathing. The Fullonica itself waits in silence, its wide entrance closed, the world inside still. The first worker arrives and pushes open the heavy wooden doors, their creak breaking the early hush. He steps into the courtyard, the cool dampness of the space wrapping around him. His first job is unlocking the storage areas, sliding old bolts free and checking the contents. Amphoras of urine stand in rows, their clay surfaces cool to the touch. These vessels, collected from public urinals around the city, are essential to the day ahead. But the worker knows to inspect them carefully. The balance must be just right. If the urine is too fresh, it won't produce enough ammonia to clean effectively. If it's too old, it turns acrid, overpowering even to men accustomed to its sharpness. He uncorks one amphora briefly, inhales and nods acceptable. As the first worker moves quietly through these opening motions, others begin to arrive. Their footsteps echo in the entrance, a rhythm that repeats every morning. They exchange brief words, not profound conversations, but the simple exchanges of men who see each other daily. The wind's up, you're late, not as late as you. Laughter, subdued but familiar, lingers for a moment before they turn to their tasks. One man moves to check the garments left by customers the evening before. Folded tunics, heavy togas, and brightly dyed cloaks are inspected and logged. He runs his hands over the fabric, checking for tears or stains that require special attention. Each piece must be accounted for. Losing a garment, or worse, returning it damaged, would tarnish the Fullonica's reputation, a risk Stephanus, the owner, cannot allow. Another worker heads to the fire pit, where the day's water will be heated. He arranges kindling and strikes sparks from flint, coaxing the first flames to life. The sharp scent of smoke begins to curl into the air, mixing with the odours already present, the earthy sharpness of fuller's earth, the sour tang of urine, the faint sulphuric undertone from stored bleaching agents. To anyone unaccustomed, the smell would be overwhelming, but to these men it is simply the smell of their trade. Nearby, a worker prepares the treading tanks. He measures water into each vat, adjusting the levels by eye, honed by years of repetition. Into the water he stirs the cleaning agents, fuller's earth, a fine clay that draws oils and impurities from wool, and sometimes a touch of sulphur for bleaching. The clay mixes unevenly at first, swirling in clouds before dissolving into the liquid. He leans over the tank, his reflection breaking into fragments as the water ripples beneath his hands. Every motion is practiced, performed hundreds of times before. Muscle memory takes over, allowing the mind to drift. The workers' bodies move like clockwork, each step fitting into the next without thought. There is a rhythm to it, a choreography of labour that feels ancient, timeless. The Fullonica begins to awaken. The fire crackles with more intensity now, water heating in iron cauldrons. The storage is unlocked, supplies accounted for, the treading tanks are prepared, their solutions ready. The garments are logged, sorted, awaiting their turn in the day's process. The courtyard hums with quiet activity, the workers moving in their familiar patterns, their voices low and calm. Every morning began the same way, checking the amphoras of urine to ensure they hadn't fermented too long. Too fresh, it didn't work. Too old, it smelled even worse and lost its cleaning power. With the Fullonica now prepared, the real work can begin. The doors are open to customers, and soon garments will arrive. Another day's labour awaits. In the busy mornings of Pompeii, the Fullonica began to fill with the arrival of garments destined for cleaning. For Romans who could afford professional laundering, personal attendance at the workshop was rare. Instead, slaves or servants carried bundles of clothing, folded tunics, voluminous togas and cloaks, delivered early in the week to ensure timely processing and later collection. These deliveries were the starting point of a carefully managed transaction, blending commerce with craft. At the entrance, workers greeted the arrivals with practiced efficiency. Each garment was unfolded and examined closely, their eyes trained to detect every imperfection. Stains told silent stories, a splash of olive oil from a recent dinner party, wine dribbled during a religious ceremony, or even blood from an unseen accident. The workers learned not to ask questions about such marks, focusing instead on their practical implications. Damage was noted, tears, worn hems, or fabric that had felted due to poor previous care, and special cleaning needs were identified. The foreman or owner stood nearby, negotiating the price with the client or their representative. Pricing was not arbitrary. It was a nuanced calculation based on the garment's size, fabric, and condition. A large wool toga requiring intense cleaning, pressing, and restoration to its bright white commanded a premium fee, several sesterces perhaps, equivalent to a day's wage for many labourers. In contrast, a simple linen tunic needing basic washing might cost only a few copper asses. This pricing reflected not only the labour involved, but also the social value of the garment. Once terms were agreed upon, workers recorded the details on small wax tablets. Marks and symbols noted the customer's identity, the number and type of garments, and any special instructions. This inventory system was crucial. On a busy day, the Fullonica might handle clothing for 20 or 30 clients simultaneously. Without careful record keeping, confusion and loss could easily occur, threatening the workshop's reputation and business. Social dynamics played a subtle but important role in these exchanges. A wealthy client servant might stride in confidently, carrying an armload of fine togas and tunics, their tone reflecting the authority of their master. Their demands were specific, and the foreman had to navigate these with diplomacy and respect. Conversely, a poorer customer might arrive alone, bearing a single garment, perhaps their only good piece of clothing, and negotiate price with caution, aware that every coin mattered. The workers, accustomed to these differences, adjusted their approach accordingly. The workers' eyes were sharp and practiced. They could assess a garment's needs almost instantly, knowing whether a stubborn wine stain required a special treatment, or if a toga's wool had become felted and needed extensive restoration. This developed expertise was a blend of experience and intuition, honed through daily exposure to countless fabrics and soils. This section highlights the Fullonica as a place of commerce as much as craft. The exchange of garments was not only a physical transaction, but also a social interaction, governed by status, negotiation, and trust. Customer relations were as vital as the labor itself, ensuring that garments were cared for and returned promptly, preserving the delicate balance between quality and business. With garments now received, inventoried, and assessed, the real work could begin. The next step was sorting the clothing by treatment type, preparing for the process that defined fulling itself, the steady, rhythmic treading. A fuller's body told its story long before a word was spoken. You could identify one in a crowd, even if they'd bathed. There was something in their stance, weight slightly forward, feet planted wide, as if constantly ready to tread. Their bodies were shaped by their work, molded over years of repetitive motion and physical demands that left undeniable marks. It started with the feet. These were not the feet of soldiers hardened by long marches or merchants accustomed to cobblestones. A fuller's feet were tools, toughened through daily immersion in treading vats. Hours of standing in water, sometimes chilled, sometimes warm, left their skin thick and leathery. Calluses formed on the soles, not as isolated patches but as a uniform armor. The toes spread wide, gripping the slippery fabric underfoot, steadying the worker against the slick stone of the vat's floor. Their ankles, though hidden from view, were remarkably strong, conditioned by the constant flexing and balancing required to maintain rhythm. A fuller's steps were deliberate, even outside the workshop, a reflection of movements repeated so often that they became unconscious. The labor didn't stop at the feet. The sustained effort of treading built leg muscles that would rival those of athletes. Calves hardened into rope, like cords, powerhouses that propelled the worker through hours of repetitive stepping. Thighs thickened from bearing the weight of waterlogged garments and the strain of the treading motion. Yet this strength came at a cost. Knees, subjected to constant pressure, often stiffened prematurely, making it difficult to rise from a crouch or navigate uneven terrain. By their 30s, many fullers moved with a slight stiffness, their joints quietly protesting years of overuse. The strain of rinsing and carrying heavy, soaked wool left its mark on the upper body. Backs bent repeatedly over basins became prone to chronic aches. The curvature of the spine altered over time. The shoulders and arms told their own stories. A fuller's dominant arm, whether right or left, was often visibly larger, its muscles asymmetrically developed from wielding wooden bats to beat fabric. The skin of their hands bore the brunt of their trade. Constant exposure to cleaning solutions, urine, fuller's earth, sulfur, dried the skin, leaving it cracked and rough. Calluses formed where tool handles pressed against palms, and faint scars revealed moments of carelessness with shears or pressing equipment. Even their lungs bore evidence of their labor. The fumes from sulfur bleaching irritated the respiratory system, leaving some workers with persistent coughs. The damp air of the vats, combined with the humidity of the courtyard, created conditions that encouraged lung infections. Over time, these invisible injuries accumulated. Breathing became shallow, labored, the body adapting to its environment in ways both subtle and profound. Yet not all the changes were negative. There was strength in these bodies, endurance honed by necessity. A Fuller might not have moved gracefully, but they moved with purpose. Their muscles, their bones, their very posture spoke of lives defined by physical effort, by the transformation of raw material into something refined. This was the cost of labor in the ancient world, the toll exacted by a trade that demanded both strength and repetition. Some adaptations were remarkable, proof of the body's resilience, its capacity to endure. Others were simple wear, the inevitable erosion of flesh and bone by unrelenting work. But the body is only part of the story. What about the mind? What did it feel like to perform the same motions, day after day, knowing tomorrow would bring the same? Beyond the physical marks of labor, there were the unseen imprints, the psychological experience of a life spent working in rhythm with the treading vats. In the treading tanks with their waist-deep water and the slippery weight of sodden wool underfoot, time moved differently. The first few minutes of labor were sharp and clear, each step intentional, each shift of balance carefully measured to avoid slipping. But as the minutes stretched into hours, a strange transformation happened. The body continued its work, maintaining the rhythm of steps, the forward and back motions that needed the fabric below, but the mind began to drift. Conscious thought loosened its grip. Awareness of the task faded, replaced by something vaguer, softer, a kind of mental fog that wasn't quite emptiness, but wasn't focus either. Modern researchers might call this state flow or automaticity, but to the men who worked the vats, it was simply survival. You couldn't think too hard about the work itself. If you did, if you focused on the endless repetition, the monotony of lifting your feet and planting them again, the cold seeping into your legs, the sting of ammonia rising from the solution, you'd go mad. Instead, the mind found other places to wander. Some workers replayed conversations from the day before, turning words over in their heads, imagining what they might have said differently. Others planned how they'd spend the few coins they might earn or what they'd do with the small reprieve of a festival day. Some worried about sick family members or debts owed. Others drifted into fantasies, picturing lives that weren't theirs, lives of wealth and ease, of warm baths and soft beds. And then there were those moments when the mind seemed to go nowhere at all, as if it had slipped into a blank space that wasn't quite sleep but wasn't entirely waking either. In the tanks, treading wet wool for the third hour, time became strange. Men report that they might suddenly realize they couldn't remember the past hour at all. Their bodies had worked while their minds went somewhere else entirely. The rhythm of repetitive tasks could be oddly soothing. There was a kind of relief in not having to think too much, in letting the body take over while the mind floated free. Unlike more intellectual forms of labor, fulling didn't demand constant decision, making or problem solving. There was no social performance anxiety in the tanks, no need to impress anyone or prove your worth beyond the simple fact of your endurance. For some, this rhythm produced a kind of calm, a meditative state born from the steady, predictable repetition of movements. The water sloshed in time with their steps. The sound of their feet echoed faintly off the stone vats. The world shrank to the boundaries of the task, and within those boundaries there was a strange kind of peace. But the peace was fragile. Repetition, for all its comforts, carried its own toll. Days blurred together, their sameness erasing any sense of progress or achievement. A worker might look up and wonder whether it was Monday or Thursday, whether this was the third garment of the morning or the 10th. The endlessness of the work could press down on the mind like a weight. There was always more laundry. The treading vats were never empty for long. Even when a garment was finished, another would take its place. For many, the most unsettling thought was that this wasn't just today's work or tomorrow's. It was their future stretching forward unchangingly. This was the mental landscape of repetitive labor, a blend of calm and frustration, of drifting thoughts and heavy realities. It was a world in which the body worked tirelessly, and the mind searched for escape wherever it could find it. But the mind wasn't entirely isolated. The Fullonica was not a place of solitary labor. It was a social environment, a workplace where hierarchies, camaraderie, and tensions shaped the daily experience. To understand the workers fully, we must step beyond their inner worlds and into the relationships that defined their shared space. Inside the Fullonica, relationships formed like the slow layering of sediment, built by repetition, shaped by proximity, and occasionally eroded by friction. The hierarchy was clear, its structure providing a framework for the daily rhythm of work. At the top was the owner, Stephanus, whose presence was infrequent but whose authority was absolute. He might appear occasionally to inspect operations, negotiate with important clients, or deliver instructions to the foreman. His absence was often more palpable than his presence, but his decisions rippled through every corner of the Fullonica. The foreman, however, was omnipresent. He was the one who assigned tasks, maintained discipline, and ensured that every garment met the standard required to keep the business running. His word carried weight, not because of rank alone, but because he understood the work. A good foreman was respected, even if begrudgingly, because he could spot a poorly cleaned tunic from across the courtyard, or predict which worker might falter before the day was done. His authority was practical, rooted in experience rather than distance. Among the workers themselves, the hierarchy continued. Seniority mattered. The older, more experienced men, whether slaves, freedmen, or free citizens, occupied an unspoken but undeniable position of influence. They knew the intricacies of the trade, the shortcuts that saved time, the tricks that avoided mistakes. Younger workers deferred to them, not because they had to, but because the older men held the knowledge that apprentices could only hope to gain. But skill alone didn't define a worker's place. Status mattered too. Slaves labored alongside freedmen, and rarely free-born citizens, yet their positions within the workshop weren't entirely equal. An enslaved man might possess more experience and skill than a freedman, yet his lack of freedom shaped how others viewed him. Freedmen, meanwhile, existed in a liminal space, no longer slaves, but not quite equals to freeborn workers. These subtle distinctions didn't always cause tension, but they were felt, like the faint pressure of a belt pulled just a little too tight. Despite these divides, camaraderie often emerged. Men who spent long hours side by side in the treading vats, or working together at the rinsing basins, developed a kind of unspoken partnership. They learned each other's rhythms, the way one man's steps aligned with the other's, the way an experienced worker could anticipate a younger one's mistakes before they happened. Bonds formed over shared labor, reinforced during brief moments of rest when they shared food, exchanged gossip from around Pompeii, or teased each other with the kind of humor that only comes from familiarity. The youngest worker, a boy of perhaps 14, was the butt of constant teasing. But when he burned his hand badly on hot water, the same men who mocked him covered his tasks for 3 days without being asked. Still, not all interactions were harmonious. Resentment simmered when work was distributed unevenly or when personality clashes flared. Conflicts were inevitable when men of different statuses and temperaments were forced into close quarters, stripped of privacy. Everyone knew everyone else's business. There was no room for secrets in the Fullonica, yet humour and conversation softened the edges of conflict. Workers likely sang songs to pass the time or told stories that grew taller with each retelling. Jokes flourished, and moments of shared laughter bridged gaps that might otherwise have widened. It wasn't perfect harmony, but a functional rhythm, a balance of tension and camaraderie that kept the workshop moving forward. Having explored the workers' social fabric, we now step into the heart of their labour. The relationships and hierarchies fade into the background as the physical work takes centre stage, beginning with the iconic task that defined the Fullonica, treading. The lives of the Fullonica's workers didn't end when the vats were emptied and the last garments hung to dry. But for many, the boundaries between work and life were blurred to the point of near invisibility. For enslaved workers, the Fullonica wasn't just their workplace, it was their world. They likely slept in cramped quarters attached to the workshop or even within the building itself. Simple straw mats or wooden pallets served as beds, and their evenings offered little more than rest and recovery for the next day's labour. The Fullonica shaped their waking hours and their dreams, the rhythmic pounding of feet in water echoing even in moments of stillness. For them, freedom existed only as a distant possibility, one that might take years of savings or the rare generosity of a master to achieve. For freedmen and wage labourers, life offered slightly more autonomy. When the day's work ended, they stepped out into the streets of Pompeii, joining the flow of the city's evening life. Their homes were modest, small rooms in insulae, the Roman apartment blocks that rose several stories high, their walls thin and their spaces crowded. These rooms weren't places of luxury but of necessity, a corner to sleep, a hearth to cook simple meals, a roof to shield against the elements. Evenings might be spent sharing bread and olives with a spouse or siblings, the flicker of an oil lamp illuminating quiet conversations. For those who lived alone, companionship was found in the bustling taverns and street-side stalls of the neighbourhood. There, workers mingled with neighbours, exchanging news, gossip and laughter over watered wine. The bonds of community, forged in the shared spaces of Pompeii's densely packed quarters, offered a sense of belonging that transcended the hardships of the day. Public baths were a common destination for those who could afford the small fee, a curious irony for fullers who spent their days immersed in water yet still sought the cleansing ritual of the baths. Here, surrounded by steam and the hum of conversation, they could wash away not just the grime of work but the weight of it as well. The baths were more than a place to clean oneself. They were centres of social life, where deals were made, friendships renewed, and rivalries played out in whispered tones. On festival days or holidays, the workers might venture to the theatre or the amphitheatre, joining the crowds to watch gladiators clash or actors perform comedies and tragedies. These moments of public spectacle were rare reprieves, brief glimpses of a world beyond the Fullonica's walls. For some, these events were a chance to dream of wealth, of adventure, of lives removed from the grind of labour. Religion, too, played a role in their lives. Neighbourhood shrines and temples punctuated their routines, offering places to pray for health, fortune or protection. One worker, it said, saved for 3 years to purchase a small terracotta figurine of Minerva, goddess of craft. It cost him a month's wages, but to him it was worth it, a gesture of gratitude for the strength to keep working, to survive. The workers didn't see their labour as separate from their lives. To them, work was simply a fact of existence, not an identity to balance against a real self. Their social identities were rooted in family, in neighbourhood ties, in the rhythms of their city's life. Despite the hardships, they lived fully human lives, defined not just by toil, but by relationships, hopes, and small joys. We've now seen the workers as whole people, bodies shaped by labour, minds navigating repetition, and lives existing beyond the walls of the Fullonica. It's time to follow them back to the heart of their day, the physical processes of fulling, where dirty cloth was transformed into something clean and new. The day's work at the Fullonica began in the treading tanks, large sunken vessels filled with a carefully prepared cleaning solution. This liquid was no ordinary water. It was a blend of water and human urine, collected fresh from public latrines, chosen for its ammonia content, a natural agent that broke down grease and dirt. Sometimes fuller's earth, a fine, absorbent clay, was mixed in to aid in pulling oils from the fabric. The men filled these vats to waist height, ensuring enough depth to soak the thick wool garments that would soon be submerged. Stepping into a tank was never comfortable. The temperature of the solution varied, sometimes cool, other times warmed by the sun or heated water mixed in. The first contact was surprising, the strange, slippery texture of the mixture clinging to skin and fabric alike, a weighty embrace that muffled movement. Footing was uncertain at first, so workers gripped supports or the tank's edge to steady themselves. Then the treading began. Rhythmic and relentless, the movement was simple yet demanding. Feet lifted and fell in a steady cadence, pushing the garments down beneath the liquid, then lifting them again to ensure thorough immersion. The water swirled faintly with each step, clouded with suspended dirt and bits of clay. This motion was repeated over and over, hour after hour. The workers' legs burning from the effort, their balance tested continuously. At first, the motion required conscious attention, but soon it became automatic. The body remembered the pattern, even when the mind wandered, allowing workers to lose themselves in thought or silence as their feet kept moving. After 10 minutes, the burn in their calves began, a slow ache that intensified steadily. Half an hour in, fatigue set in, muscles cramped, joints ached, but stopping was not an option. The rhythm became a kind of meditation, a dance of endurance. By the time an hour passed, exhaustion weighed heavily on every limb. Yet the steady motion continued, almost mechanical, until the fabric beneath their feet softened and released oils and grime into the solution. The garments themselves transformed during this process. Initially stiff and heavy from accumulated dirt and sweat, they gradually became supple, lighter, more pliable. The mixtures ammonia and clay worked to strip away the residues of daily wear, loosening particles embedded deep in the wool's fibers. Each step in the tank was a step closer to restoration. For a single garment, treading might last an hour or longer. On busy days, workers could spend 6 to 8 hours immersed in this task, their bodies bearing the constant strain. The repetitive nature of the work demanded stamina, strength, and resilience. The ammonia in the urine would sting any small cut or scrape on the feet. Workers quickly learned to check their feet carefully each morning. A single blister could make the day agony. Despite the discomfort, treading was the foundation of fulling. It was the method by which dirty cloth became clean, oily fabric became fresh, worn wool was revived. But this was only the first step. Once the garments had been thoroughly trodden, they required rinsing, a process just as vital, but different in its demands and sensations. The garments lifted from the treading tanks were heavy, dripping wet and saturated with the cleaning solution that had worked its way into every fibre. The weight of wool soaked in water and ammonia was immense, and the workers gripped the fabric tightly as they hauled it across the courtyard. The solution, laden with loosened oils, dirt, and the residue of fuller's earth, clung stubbornly to the cloth. It couldn't stay. The cleansing wasn't complete until the garments had been rinsed thoroughly and repeatedly in clean water. The rinsing basins were shallower than the treading vats, crafted from stone or terracotta and positioned strategically around the courtyard. Fresh water flowed into them through channels connected to Pompeii's aqueduct system. The water was precious, its movement carefully controlled, but a Fullonica required a steady supply. Without it, the process would grind to a halt. One by one, the garments were submerged in the cool, clear water. A worker stood over the basin, his body bent forward, hands plunged deep into the water as he worked the fabric. He turned it, pressed it, agitated it, coaxing out the dirt-laden solution. The water darkened almost immediately, clouded with grime released from the cloth. The worker would lift the garment, wringing it out with strong, practiced hands before plunging it back into the basin for another cycle. Rinsing wasn't a single-step process. Each garment required multiple rinses. The first rinse removed the bulk of the oils and dirt, but remnants remained. Workers inspected the cloth carefully, holding it up to the light to check for discoloration, stains, or unevenness. Stubborn spots were treated individually. A smear of grease might need another application of fuller's earth, rubbed into the fabric like a paste. A faint yellowing might call for sulfur paste, a pungent but effective solution. Once treated, the garment returned to the basin for another round of rinsing. The process demanded strength and endurance. Back muscles strained as workers bent over the basins for hours. Hands, submerged in water for most of the day, grew wrinkled and cold. The skin toughened and cracked from constant exposure. The weight of the waterlogged garments lifted and twisted repeatedly, tested their arms and shoulders. Yet the workers moved with efficiency, their motions honed by years of repetition. They didn't need to think about the process. It was instinctive. Their bodies knew the rhythm, and their senses guided them. Workers could tell by the smell when a garment was properly rinsed, not by the absence of smell, but by the presence of only the wool or linen's natural scent, like rain on stone. The sharpness of ammonia, the earthy residue of clay, and the damp bitterness of dirt all faded, leaving behind something clean and simple. The courtyard was alive with the sound of water. The splash of fabric being submerged, the slosh of water moving through basins, the drip, drip of liquid falling from garments as they were lifted and wrung out. These sounds, constant and rhythmic, created a backdrop to the work, soothing in their repetition. Rinsing wasn't glamorous, but its thoroughness was essential. It prepared the garments for the next stage, ensuring they were free of impurities before they could be dried and finished. The Fullonica's workers understood this as they rinsed and wrung, their hands moving tirelessly through the water. Clean but soaking wet, the garments were now ready to leave the basins. They would be carried to the open air courtyard, where they would meet the Mediterranean sun. It was time for them to dry. After the final rinse, the garments were heavy but free of cleaning agents and dirt. Workers twisted the fabric tightly, using their body weight to squeeze out as much water as possible. Water streamed from the folds, glistening in the rising sun as it fell back into basins or onto the courtyard floor. This wringing was no gentle task. Thick wool resisted, soaked deep, and required strength and patience to press moisture from its fibers. Only when the garments were sufficiently wrung did they move to the next stage, drying. The courtyard, once a serene garden space, had been transformed into a practical drying area. Ropes were stretched taut across the open sky, anchored to columns and walls, forming lines on which clothes could hang. Poles and wooden frames provided additional surfaces for spreading fabric. Togas, delicate in their folds and shape, were laid flat on smooth surfaces to preserve their form, while tunics and cloaks were hung over ropes, allowing air to circulate freely around them. Heavier items were placed where the breeze was strongest, ensuring even drying and preventing damp spots that might cause mildew. The workers attended to the drying process carefully. The sun's path changed with the seasons, and they adjusted garments accordingly, turning them, repositioning lines, moving fabric to catch breezes or avoid shadows. Humidity was a constant consideration. On more humid days, drying took longer and risked mildew, which could ruin expensive clothing. Fortunately, Pompeii's Mediterranean climate was generally favorable, with long stretches of warm, dry weather ideal for sun-drying textiles. The sensory atmosphere of the courtyard was striking. Bright southern sunlight streamed down, casting sharp shadows between columns and ropes. White fabric glowed brilliantly against the deep blue sky, fluttering gently in the soft breeze. The scent of damp wool mingled with warm air, a rich, earthy aroma that spoke of transformation from dirty cloth to something fresh and wearable. Sometimes in afternoon heat, workers would stand in the courtyard's center, surrounded by drying white fabric glowing in the sun, and feel transported, as if they stood in a field of strange rectangular clouds. The lightness of the cloth, the gentle movement, and the warmth combined to create a moment of quiet beauty amid the labor. Drying times varied widely. A light linen tunic might dry within 2 hours on a hot, sunny day, ready to move on to finishing. A heavy wool toga, however, could require 6 to 8 hours, or even overnight, to dry thoroughly. Patience was as essential as skill. Though drying was less physically demanding than treading or rinsing, it demanded vigilance. Uneven drying could cause fabric to warp or develop unpleasant odors. Workers checked garments regularly, turning or repositioning them to ensure the best results. But drying was not the final stage. Once garments were clean and dry, they still needed finishing treatments. Pressing to remove wrinkles, raising the nap to restore softness, and sometimes bleaching to achieve the brilliant white that Romans prized were all essential steps before a garment could return to its owner. The transformation from dirty to clean was nearly complete, but the final polish awaited. The final stages of garment care were precise, careful, and deliberate. By now, the garments were clean and dry, their transformation nearly complete. But they still bore the marks of their journey through treading, rinsing, and drying, wrinkles, flattened fibers, and uneven surfaces that needed attention. The finishing process began with pressing, a task that demanded patience and precision. Pressing involved large wooden frames fitted with boards and tightening mechanisms. Workers placed each garment carefully between the boards, ensuring folds were aligned exactly as they should be. This was particularly critical for togas, whose draped folds required precise placement to maintain their iconic Roman appearance. Once positioned, the workers slowly tightened the press, turning the screws or levers with steady hands. The wood creaked under the strain as pressure built, compressing the fabric evenly. The process smoothed the surface of the cloth and shaped it, giving it a crisp, refined appearance. Pressing wasn't rushed. Garments often remained in the press for an hour or more, gradually conforming to the desired shape. While the presses worked, other tasks unfolded in the courtyard. Wool garments, especially togas, needed their nap restored after the aggressive cleaning and pressing processes. The nap, the soft, slightly fuzzy surface that gave wool its warmth and texture, was raised using tools that required both skill and delicacy. Workers used thistle, like teasel plants, their hooked spines perfect for lifting fibers without tearing them. Alternatively, some used bronze tools designed to mimic teasels, their fine, precise edges allowing for controlled work. The technique had to be exact, too much pressure, and the fabric could be damaged too little, and the nap would remain flat, lifeless. This task wasn't for the inexperienced. It required a craftsman's touch, a balance of strength and subtlety learned through years of practice. Once the nap was raised, workers inspected the garments thoroughly. They checked seams and edges, searching for any damage caused during cleaning. The vigorous motions of treading, the weight of water, and the strain of pressing could sometimes loosen stitching or fray edges. If flaws were found, they were repaired on the spot. Basic stitching repairs were part of the Fullonica's service, ensuring that garments returned to their owners not just cleaned, but restored. Every step of this stage spoke to the skill of the workers. Unlike the raw physicality of treading or rinsing, finishing required fine motor control, a sharp eye for detail, and an understanding of fabric that only came with experience. These tasks were often entrusted to senior workers or specialists, those who had spent years mastering the subtleties of wool and linen. The owner himself sometimes performed final quality checks, running his hands over pressed fabric with eyes closed, feeling for imperfections invisible to sight but detectable by trained touch. His approval was the last step before a garment was deemed ready for its owner. The courtyard, once alive with splashing water and rhythmic treading, now hummed with quieter activity. The presses stood firm, their wooden frames holding their load under pressure. Workers moved carefully between tasks. Their focus shifted from laborious cleaning to meticulous refinement. The garments, transformed through these final touches, now looked as though they had never been stained or worn. With garments now cleaned, dried, pressed, and finished, they were ready to return to their owners. But before we follow that final transaction, we pause to understand the mysterious substances that made this process possible. The chemicals Romans relied on, unwittingly harnessing the principles of chemistry long before the science itself existed. To the Romans, waste was never just waste. Even something as humble and unpleasant as human urine found its place in their economy, particularly in the Fullonica. It was an essential ingredient, the cornerstone of the cleaning solutions that transformed filthy garments into pristine essentials of Roman life. Public urinals scattered throughout Pompeii collected this liquid gold, which fullers either purchased or gathered freely. Every morning, amphoras of urine arrived at the Fullonica, ready to be put to use. And while the process might seem distasteful to modern sensibilities, for Romans, it was simply practical. Fresh urine wasn't ideal, it needed to age just slightly. As it sat, bacteria in the liquid broke down urea, a compound naturally present in urine, into ammonia. This transformation was crucial. Ammonia, though the Romans wouldn't have known its name, was their secret weapon. It is alkaline, meaning it has a high pH level, which makes it particularly effective at breaking down oils and fats. These substances, including lanolin from wool and the body oils accumulated in worn fabric, are naturally hydrophobic, meaning they resist water. Ammonia molecules, however, surround these fats and oils, breaking them apart and suspending them in water where they can be rinsed away. The Romans didn't understand the molecular science of this process, but centuries of trial and error had taught them that urine worked. Fullers observed its effectiveness and refined its usage over generations. The balance had to be just right. Too fresh, and it lacked the necessary ammonia. Too old, and its odor became overpowering, even to those who worked with it daily. The workers learned to judge its readiness by smell, colour, and even the faint sharpness it left in the air. The practicality of urine collection wasn't lost on Roman society. It was so integral to urban life that even the Emperor Vespasian saw its potential. He famously introduced a tax on urine collection, ensuring the empire profited from this unassuming resource. When criticized for taxing something so ignoble, Vespasian reportedly held up a coin and said, "Pecunia non olet," money doesn't smell. The phrase became a lasting reminder of Rome's pragmatic approach to resource management. Yet for the workers, the smell was impossible to ignore. Ammonia has a sharpness that stings the eyes and bites at the throat. Even in the open-air courtyards of the Fullonica, where ventilation helped disperse the fumes, the odour lingered. Workers grew accustomed to it over time, but never immune. They learned to breathe shallowly, to wipe their watering eyes, and to endure. Aged urine was less offensive than fresh, but it was still far from pleasant. The Fullonica carried its own signature scent, one that marked those who worked there long after they left for the day. Romans walked past public urinals knowing their contribution might soon be cleaning a senator's toga. Waste in, wealth out, the circular economy of ancient Rome. Urine was the fuller's most famous tool, but it wasn't their only one. Clay and earth, each with specialized properties, played an equally important role in the transformation of dirty cloth. To complete our understanding of Roman cleaning chemistry, we must now turn our attention to these remarkable natural substances. If urine was the Fullonica's most famous tool, fuller's earth was its quiet counterpart, an unsung hero in the battle against dirt and grease. Known to the Romans as Creta Fullonia, fuller's earth was a naturally occurring clay, remarkable for its absorbent properties. Fine and soft to the touch, it was composed primarily of minerals like bentonite or atapollite, which gave it the unique ability to draw oils, pigments, and impurities from fabric. To the fullers of Pompeii, it was as indispensable as water or fire. When mixed with water, fuller's earth transformed into a smooth paste that could be worked into wool or linen. Its function wasn't to dissolve stains, but to absorb them. Through a process called adsorption, the clay's particles clung to oils and grease, pulling them from the fabric's fibers and trapping them on the clay's surface. Once the garment had been treated, rinsing washed away the clay, carrying the impurities with it. The result was fabric that felt and looked cleaner, free of the residues that resisted water alone. Romans sourced fuller's earth from specific deposits, and not all clay was created equal. Some regions became famous for high-quality fuller's earth, their quarries supplying cities across the empire. In Pompeii, local deposits likely provided most of the supply, but for particularly challenging stains or prestigious clients, imported clay of superior grade might be used. Workers judged the quality of fuller's earth by its texture and colour. The best clay was fine-grained, light in colour, and formed a smooth, pliable paste when mixed with water. Coarser, darker clays were less effective and reserved for less delicate tasks. The skill of the fullers lay in knowing when and how to use fuller's earth. For greasy stains, such as those left by food or oil lamps, clay was far more effective than urine. Its ability to draw out and trap fat molecules made it indispensable for treating spills that ordinary rinsing couldn't touch. On the other hand, ammonia from urine was better suited to breaking down body odors and sweat. Sometimes the two were used in tandem, clay to lift the grease, followed by ammonia to neutralize odors. A handful of the right clay properly worked into fabric could remove a stain that hours of water washing couldn't touch. Romans didn't know why. It would be centuries before the science of adsorption was understood, but they knew it worked. That knowledge, passed down through generations, became central to the fulling trade. The significance of fuller's earth extended far beyond Pompeii. Its reputation endured through the ages, so much so that the term itself survived into modern English. During the Industrial Revolution, fuller's earth was still used in wool production, its role largely unchanged until synthetic detergents gradually replaced it. The clay that once cleaned Roman togas continued to serve humanity for nearly 2 millennia, beyond their practical effectiveness. Clays like Fuller's earth represented a fascinating intersection of nature and human ingenuity. They were simple substances shaped by geological processes that became tools of transformation in skilled hands. This blend of simplicity and effectiveness is part of what makes ancient techniques so enduringly captivating. But clay and ammonia alone weren't enough for the most challenging task of all, achieving the brilliant white that defined Roman togas. For that, Fuller's turned to sulfur, harnessing its potent chemical properties to bleach fabric and restore its brightness. The next step in understanding Roman cleaning chemistry lies in the sharp, acrid fumes of sulfur and the extraordinary results they produced. In Rome, white wasn't just a color, it was a statement. A brilliantly white toga signaled wealth, citizenship, and respectability, setting its wearer apart in a society obsessed with appearances. But keeping wool brilliantly white was no small feat. Wool naturally yellowed with age, wear, and exposure to the elements. Dirt and oils clung to its fibers, and even the most thorough cleaning with urine or Fuller's earth couldn't fully restore its brightness. To achieve the dazzling white Romans prized, Fuller's turned to one of their most potent tools, sulfur. The bleaching process began with preparation. A garment destined for fumigation was carefully stretched over a dome-shaped frame, resembling an inverted basket. This frame created a small chamber beneath the fabric, a space designed to trap the fumes that would do the work of whitening. Sulfur, either in chunks or powder form, was placed in a shallow dish or pan beneath the frame. Once ignited, the sulfur began to burn, releasing thick, acrid sulfur dioxide gas. This gas rose into the chamber, enveloping the stretched fabric and penetrating its fibers. The chemistry behind sulfur bleaching, though unknown to the Romans, was remarkably effective. Sulfur dioxide interacts with chromophores, molecules responsible for color, breaking them down and neutralizing their ability to reflect hues. As a result, even stubborn discolorations faded, leaving behind a bright, clean white. The transformation was striking. A yellowed toga, dulled by weeks of wear, could emerge from fumigation looking almost new, its whiteness restored to the brilliance that symbolized Roman virtue and dignity. But the process was not without its challenges or its dangers. Sulfur dioxide is highly toxic, irritating to both the skin and respiratory system. Workers tasked with tending the fumigation had to remain vigilant. The first breath of sulfur fumes would make a new worker's eyes water and throat burn. Experienced fullers learned to stand upwind, breathing shallowly to avoid inhaling too much of the gas. Even with precautions, prolonged exposure took a toll. Chronic coughing and respiratory problems were common among those who worked closely with sulfur, and the fumes left a lingering irritation that couldn't be entirely avoided. The process also required careful monitoring. Bleaching wasn't instantaneous. It took time for the fumes to fully whiten the fabric. A garment might remain under fumigation for an hour or more, depending on its size and the degree of discoloration. Over-bleaching was a constant risk. If left too long, the sulfur could weaken the wool fibers, making the garment prone to tearing or fraying. Fullers developed a keen sense of timing, knowing exactly when to remove the fabric to achieve the perfect balance between brightness and durability. Despite the hazards, sulfur fumigation was indispensable for high-quality garments. Repeated cleaning and bleaching gradually wore down wool, meaning even well-maintained togas had a limited lifespan. This created a steady demand for new textiles, ensuring the fuller's trade remained vital to Roman society. The cost of brilliant white fabric wasn't measured only in money, it was etched into the lungs of the workers and the fibers of the cloth itself. Yet, for Romans, the result was worth the sacrifice. With their chemical arsenal, urine, clays, and sulfur, fullers had the tools to tackle nearly any challenge. But the true art of fulling lay in knowing how to combine these substances with technique, a skillful balance of science and craft. The next step in understanding their trade is to explore how they solved the specific problems every garment presented. No two stains were ever the same, and neither were the garments that carried them. When workers at the Fullonica received a garment, their first task wasn't cleaning, it was diagnosing. Each piece of fabric told a story, and the stains etched into its fibers offered clues. A wine stain spilled during a dinner party, grease from a cooking mishap, blood from an injury or sacrifice. All were reminders of the lives these garments had witnessed. The fuller's job was to read these marks and decide how best to erase them while preserving the integrity of the cloth. An experienced fuller could smell a garment and identify the stain before seeing it. Wine had a sweet note, oil a heavy thickness, blood a sharp metallic edge. Their senses worked alongside their hands, eyes, and instincts honed by years of repetition. The first step was careful inspection, identifying the type of stain, its location, its age, and the fabric affected. Wool was resilient, able to withstand aggressive treatment, while linen, though lighter, was more delicate and prone to weakening if overprocessed. Dyed fabrics presented their own challenges. The wrong cleaning method could strip or dull expensive colors, turning vibrant reds and blues into muted shadows of themselves. Wine stains were among the most common, inevitable, in a culture where wine flowed freely at every meal and social gathering. If the stain was fresh, it could be treated immediately with rinsing, using water to dilute and lift the pigment before it set. For older wine stains, fullers turned to fuller's earth. The fine clay mixed into a paste was worked into the fabric and left to absorb the stain's residue before the garment underwent standard cleaning. The process was straightforward but effective, relying on the clay's natural adsorption to trap the molecules of the stain. Oil stains, however, were a more stubborn adversary. Greasy residue from cooking, oil lamps, or beauty products resisted water entirely. Here, fuller's earth was indispensable. The clay's ability to bind to fats made it the only reliable solution. Workers would knead the paste into the fabric, ensuring it penetrated deep into the fibers, then rinse it away, removing both the clay and the oil it carried. Blood stains with their unique challenges demanded a different approach. Fresh blood had to be treated with cold water. Heat, even warm water, would cause the protein in blood to coagulate, setting the stain permanently. Once rinsed, the garment would soak in a solution rich in ammonia from urine, which acted as a natural enzyme, breaking down what remained. This was a slow process, requiring patience and care. Ink stains, rare but not unheard of, were the bane of Fullonica workers. The pigments in ink were notoriously difficult to remove. Sometimes, workers would attempt to lift the stain with acids derived from fermented fruit, but success was rare. In many cases, ink stains were simply declared permanent, a mark the owner would have to live with. The skill of the fuller wasn't just in knowing what to use, but in understanding how far they could push each fabric. Wool could take a beating, but linen required a gentler touch. Expensive dyed garments needed to be tested on hidden corners to ensure cleaning didn't ruin their vibrant hues. Every decision was based on instinct built from knowledge passed down orally from master to apprentice. Nothing was written, and everything was learned through doing. The fullers practiced a craft that was both art and science, their expertise a blend of observation, tradition, and intuition. Now that we've explored the tools, substances, and techniques they employed, it's time to follow a garment's complete journey, from its arrival at the Fullonica to its return to the owner, restored and transformed. Running a Fullonica was not just a matter of skill, it was a matter of economics. Behind the rhythmic treading of vats and the careful fumigation of togas was a business finely balanced between costs and revenue, risk and reward. The financial realities of operating such an establishment were complex, requiring both resources and strategy to remain profitable. The costs began with the building itself. A Fullonica like Stephanus's, located on a prime corner lot in Pompeii, represented a significant investment. Such a property could be owned outright, a sign of wealth and stability, or rented, in which case monthly payments added to the operating expenses. Beyond the building, the infrastructure required maintenance. Treading tanks, rinsing basins, pressing equipment all saw constant use and wear. Cracked basins needed repair, wooden presses required reinforcement, and drainage systems needed clearing to keep the operation running smoothly. These upkeep costs were unavoidable and ongoing. Then there were the materials. Fuller's earth, sulfur, firewood or charcoal for heating water, and even the amphoras used to transport and store cleaning agents came at a price. While some resources like urine were collected freely or purchased cheaply, others, such as high-quality clay or imported sulfur, were more expensive. Water, though technically free from the aqueduct system, required its own infrastructure investment. Channels and cisterns had to be built and maintained to ensure a steady supply. Labor was another significant expense, though it varied depending on the workforce. Enslaved workers required food, clothing, and shelter, ongoing costs that added up over time. Freed workers or wage laborers, on the other hand, demanded direct payment, often in the form of daily or weekly wages. In either case, the labor force was one of the Fullonica's largest and most essential investments. Without skilled and enduring workers, the business could not function. Against these costs, fullers charged for their services. Fees varied depending on the garment and the work required. A basic washing of a linen tunic might cost just a few asses, small copper coins within reach of most citizens. But the complete cleaning, pressing, and brightening of a wool toga, a labor-intensive process requiring multiple steps, could cost several sesterces, larger silver, brass coins equivalent to a day's wages for an average laborer. For wealthy clients, this was a reasonable price to maintain their appearance of status. For fullers, it was the bread and butter of their business. Revenue followed patterns dictated by Roman life. Regular clients provided steady income, particularly wealthier citizens who sent garments weekly or bi-weekly. Festivals and major social events brought surges in business, as everyone sought to look their best for public appearances. However, competition was always a factor. Pompeii housed at least 3 other fulleries, and customers had options. Reputation, location, and quality of service played a critical role in determining which Fullonica thrived. Stephanus's establishment, with its large size and prominent location, suggests success. His Fullonica likely catered to a mix of wealthy patrons and middle-class citizens, maintaining a steady income while capitalizing on seasonal demand. Fulling could generate substantial wealth, for the owner at least. The workers, whether enslaved or free, saw little of it. The profits flowed upward, while the laborers shouldered the cost in sweat, strength, and health. A single perfectly cleaned, pressed, and brightened toga might earn a fuller more in one job than a day laborer made in 3 days. Yet the laborer's work didn't destroy his lungs with sulfur fumes. Economics required customers, and customers meant relationships. Understanding how fullers interacted with their clientele reveals the social dynamics of trust, class, and reputation that governed their business. In Pompeii, the relationship between fullers and their customers was shaped by more than simple transactions. It was a delicate balancing act, steeped in the complexities of Roman class consciousness, a society where status was as visible as the garments a person wore. Fullers provided an essential service, but their labor, rooted in substances like urine and sulfur, placed them in an ambiguous social position. They were respected for their skill, needed for their services, but never quite admired. Most customers never set foot in a Fullonica themselves. Instead, they sent slaves or freedmen to drop off garments and communicate instructions. The slaves arrived burdened with bundles of tunics, togas, and cloaks, reciting their master's specific needs. This toga must be ready by the festival. The tunic needs whitening. This oil stain must be removed. The fullers, often the foreman, listened carefully, inspecting each garment with experienced hands and eyes. Negotiations followed, a price for each piece, a delivery date, a promise of quality. Delivery times varied based on the complexity of the work, but typically ranged from 3 to 5 days. Occasionally, a wealthy individual would visit the Fullonica in person, a rare but striking occurrence. Their presence created a paradox. Here was a member of the elite, dependent on the fuller's expertise to maintain their status, yet stepping into a space considered polluting. For fullers, the interaction required deference without subservience. They had to project competence and reliability without overstepping social boundaries. A poor impression could lose a valuable client. A good one could secure steady business for years. Trust was the foundation of these relationships. Customers left behind their most valuable textiles, expensive, carefully tailored, often dyed in rare and costly colors. A single mistake, a lost garment, a botched cleaning could destroy a Fullonica's reputation. In Pompeii, where gossip travelled faster than goods, word of a mishap could spread quickly, driving customers to competitors. Conversely, consistent quality and reliability built loyalty. Satisfied clients recommended a Fullonica to friends and family, and word-of-mouth endorsements were as valuable as any painted sign. Successful fullers like Stephanus navigated these dynamics with care. His establishment's size and prominent location suggest he served a wide clientele, likely including wealthy patrons. His name appears in graffiti across Pompeii, on election slogans endorsing candidates, on walls where neighbours left messages. These mentions reflect not just his business presence, but his visibility in the community. Fullers like Stephanus participated in civic life, making offerings at temples, sponsoring events, and lending their names to local politics. They were respected members of the commercial class, yet always stopped just short of full social acceptance. When election season came, candidates sought Fuller's public endorsements. Painted slogans on walls declared, "The Fullers recommend Gaius." Their votes and influence mattered, even if their smell was joked about. Despite their contributions, Fullers would never be mistaken for aristocrats. Their trade, while profitable, was tied to materials and processes that marked them as labourers. Yet their presence in Pompeii's social fabric was undeniable. They were visible, essential, and in their way respected. Beyond these individual relationships, fullers found solidarity and identity within their professional community. The collegium, or guild, provided structure, support, and a sense of belonging that transcended the walls of the Fullonica. Understanding this broader network reveals how fullers found meaning beyond the daily grind of their trade. In ancient Rome, work was rarely just a job. For the fullers of Pompeii, their labour was more than a way to clean garments and earn a living. It was part of a collective identity, one rooted in the Collegium Fullonum, the Fullers' Guild. This organisation offered more than just professional affiliation. It provided solidarity, structure, and a sense of belonging in a society that often overlooked individual labourers. The Collegium Fullonum, like other Roman craft guilds, blended the functions of a trade union, a social club, and a religious society. Membership was open to fullers from across Pompeii, whether they were owners like Stephanus, skilled freedmen, or enslaved workers who found a place within the community. This was a space where status differences could momentarily blur, united by the shared craft that defined their lives. The guild met regularly, often in a rented space or a room within a member's establishment. These meetings weren't just administrative, they were opportunities for camaraderie. Members paid dues into a treasury which funded collective needs like religious offerings, public celebrations, or mutual aid. When a worker was injured or fell ill, the collegium could provide financial support, ensuring a temporary safety net in a society that otherwise offered none. Religious devotion was central to the guild's identity. Minerva, the goddess of craft, wisdom, and strategic skill, was their patron deity. Guild members honoured her with offerings and rituals, often pooling resources to dedicate statues or plaques in her name. Once a year, during the Quinquatria festival celebrating Minerva, fullers across Pompeii would close their shops, dress in their cleanest white garments, and process through the city streets. For one day, they were not labourers mocked for the smell of their trade. They were craftsmen, celebrated for their essential role in Roman life. Once a year, during the Quinquatria festival honouring Minerva, fullers across Pompeii closed their shops, dressed in clean white, and processed through the city, a rare day when they were honoured for their craft rather than mocked for their smell. The guild also gave fullers a voice in the local economy. Individually, a fuller's power was limited, but collectively, the collegium could negotiate business practices, set fair prices for services, and even influence civic affairs. Inscriptions from Pompeii mention the Collegium Fullonum by name, suggesting its presence and influence in the city's public life. Guild members endorsed political candidates, their recommendations painted on walls alongside those of other influential groups. The psychological importance of the collegium cannot be overstated. In a society where workers held little individual status, the guild offered recognition and dignity. Membership turned isolated laborers into part of a larger whole, giving them a shared identity and mutual obligations. It was a reminder that even in the harsh realities of Roman labor, community could provide strength and meaning. With the Collegium Fullonum, fullers found more than just professional organization. They found connection, purpose, and support. Having explored the business, customer relations, and guild structures, we're now ready to step into the Fullonica itself. Let's experience a full day of work following the rhythm of labor from dawn to dusk, piecing together the life of the fullers as it unfolded hour by hour. In ancient Pompeii, where life unfolded in close quarters and word traveled faster than carts on cobblestone streets, reputation was everything. For fullers, reputation was just a matter of pride. It was survival. With multiple Fullonica operating in a city of roughly 20,000 people, competition was inevitable. Demand kept most businesses afloat, but not all fulleries were created equal. Some thrived, while others faded quietly into obscurity. The difference was in the details, the quality of work, the reliability of service, and, most importantly, the trust of their customers. A fuller's worst nightmare wasn't hard work or bad smells. It was returning a senator's toga with a new stain acquired during cleaning. That kind of mistake could end a business. Reputation began with quality. Garments had to be returned not just clean, but immaculate. Whites needed to shine, colors had to remain vibrant, and stains had to disappear as if they never existed. Reliability was equally important. When customers were promised their garments by a certain day, they expected those promises to be kept. A missed delivery could mean a missed festival, a ruined public appearance, or, worst of all, a damaged reputation for the customer themselves. Speed also played a role. While complex jobs like a full restoration of a toga might take several days, fullers who could handle simpler tasks quickly earned favor with busy clients. Pricing mattered too. Charging fair rates kept middle-class clients loyal, while gouging drove them to competitors. Yet it wasn't always about being the cheapest. Wealthier customers would pay more for exceptional service, knowing their garments were in skilled hands. When problems arose, how a fuller responded could make or break a relationship. If a garment was damaged, did the fuller offer compensation? If a complicated stain resisted cleaning, was the customer informed honestly? Or was the issue concealed? Fullers who handled these challenges with transparency and fairness built long-term loyalty. Those who didn't found their reputations tarnished, their names whispered as warnings in Pompeii's bustling streets. Location was another key factor. Fullonica, situated near wealthy neighborhoods or along main thoroughfares, had a distinct advantage. Visibility mattered. Pompeii's fulleries were open to the street, their work observable to anyone passing by. Potential customers could see vats steaming, workers treading, and garments drying in the sun. This transparency was both opportunity and risk. Success was on full display, but so were failures. Stephanus' Fullonica, with its prominent corner location and substantial size, suggests it was one of Pompeii's more successful establishments. Its strategic position likely drew traffic from nearby affluent areas, while its size allowed it to handle larger volumes of work than smaller competitors. Beyond cleaning, fullers often offered additional services that enhanced their reputation. Minor textile repairs, storage for off-season clothing, and advice on fabric care were common extras. These services added value and built relationships, turning one-time customers into regular clients. Reputation wasn't built overnight. It came from years of consistent quality, visible success, and participation in civic life. Fullers who supported local festivals, made religious offerings, or endorsed political candidates showed they were invested in the community, not just their business. Having understood the pressures and rewards of reputation in Pompeii's competitive market, we're ready to step into the heart of the Fullonica itself. Let us follow the workers through a complete day, from dawn to dusk, and experience the rhythm of labor that sustained both the business and its reputation. Before the sun's first light touched Pompeii's streets, the Fullonica stood silent and still, a sleeping giant awaiting the day's awakening. In the pre-dawn darkness, the first worker arrived, perhaps the foreman or a senior slave, carrying the quiet weight of responsibility. The heavy wooden doors, worn smooth by years of use, creaked as they were pushed open, breaking the night's hush. Inside, the courtyard lay cool and damp, shadows clinging to every corner. The worker moved deliberately, checking the space with practiced eyes. Were the tanks secure? Had any water leaked overnight? Were tools in their proper places? Damage, however small, could disrupt a day's workflow. The flicker of a torch revealed faint cracks in plaster and the faint smell of stale dampness. Fires were started to heat water, kindling cokes to flame, smoke curling upward through open roof spaces. The solution in the treading vats was stirred, ensuring the fuller's earth and urine mixed evenly, ready for the garments about to arrive. As dawn broke, the soft Mediterranean light spilled over rooftops, diffusing gently into the courtyard. The sun crept higher, touching columns and walls with indirect warmth before bathing everything in golden clarity. One by one, more workers appeared, their footsteps echoing softly on stone. Greetings were exchanged, short, familiar, unhurried. Each man moved with the easy rhythm of routine, settling into stations they knew like the palms of their hands. The air began to fill with the sounds of preparation. Water splashed as basins were filled and emptied. Cloth rustled as garments were arranged nearby, waiting their turn. The low murmur of conversation rose, a mix of practical instructions and casual banter, while the scent of ammonia mingled with damp wool and the faint sulfur tang from stored bleaching agents. The Fullonica was stirring to life. The foreman reviewed the day's schedule, prioritizing tasks by customer promise and garment needs. Some togas required immediate attention for upcoming events. Other tunics needed deep cleaning but allowed for more time. The coordination was precise, a choreography that balanced urgency with care. By the third hour after dawn, you could walk past any Fullonica in Pompeii and know instantly it was open. The particular smell, ammonia, wet wool, sulfur, rolled out into the street like an invisible announcement. The workers began their steady movements, warm-up stretches shaking off sleep and stiffness. Legs flexed, backs straightened, hands moved with increasing confidence. The first rhythmic steps in the treading vats sounded, a slow, steady beat that marked the beginning of labor. The courtyard, once silent and cool, was now alive with purpose. By mid-morning, the Fullonica had reached its working rhythm. All positions were filled, each man absorbed in his task. The day's labor was underway, a familiar pattern unfolding beneath Pompeii's brightening sky. By midday, the Mediterranean sun hung high and relentless over Pompeii, turning the Fullonica's courtyard into a furnace of light and heat. The shadows that had once offered brief relief shrank to nothing, and stone surfaces radiated warmth, intensifying the day's demands. Workers who had arrived fresh hours earlier now bore the unmistakable marks of fatigue. Legs burned from hours of treading in waterlogged vats, feet pruned and sore from constant exposure to the damp, slippery surfaces. The heat pressed down on them, making each movement heavier, each breath more labored. The men moved with a mechanical persistence born of repetition and necessity. Sweat poured freely, soaking tunics and streaking faces. Breaths came in shallow, rapid gasps, the effort of labor magnified by the stifling air. Breaks were brief and rare, perhaps a few minutes to drink from a water skin, lean against a cool wall, wipe the salt from brows, before returning to the unyielding rhythm. The work could not pause, garments awaited, customers expected results, and the day's quota must be met. A hierarchy of endurance shaped the labor. The youngest workers and slaves took on the most physically demanding tasks, the relentless treading, the heavy lifting and rinsing. Their bodies were pushed to the limits of human endurance, conditioned by years of similar days. Senior workers, often freedmen or more experienced slaves, assumed roles requiring less brute force, supervising the workflow, performing delicate finishing touches, or managing customer communications. Their fatigue was different, more mental than physical, but no less real. At midday, even experienced fullers sometimes paused, standing absolutely still in the courtyard heat, as if their bodies had briefly forgotten how to move, then shook themselves and continued. despite exhaustion, the quality of work could never slip. Rushing risked damage to costly garments and loss of reputation for the Fullonica. Precision remained essential, even as muscles ached and minds longed for rest. Workers developed psychological strategies to endure. Some detached mentally, letting their bodies carry on while their thoughts wandered elsewhere. Others found distraction in quiet conversation or low songs, sharing moments of levity amidst hardship. The grinding nature of manual labor in pre-industrial times was unvarnished and relentless. For these fullers, summer's heat was an added burden, yet they persisted, embodying a stoic endurance that defined their trade. The physical toll was severe, but so was their commitment to craft. As midday passed, the intensity of labor began to yield to the gradual ease of afternoon. Tasks initiated in the morning moved toward completion. New garments arrived to be sorted and processed, and the workers, though weary, prepared to see the day's work through to its end. The afternoon sun moved steadily westward, its intensity softening as it crossed Pompeii's sky. The Fullonica, which had roared with the exertion and heat of midday, now settled into a more measured rhythm. The garments that had endured hours of treading and rinsing during the morning were now stretched across ropes and laid on frames in the open courtyard, catching what remained of the sun's warmth. Workers moved among them with practiced care, gently turning fabrics to ensure even drying and prevent the dampness that bred mildew. Some pieces, having dried sufficiently, were ready for the next stage, pressing and finishing. The wooden presses, sturdy and creaking under use, were readied once more. Workers carefully unfolded the cloth, positioning folds precisely as tradition demanded, then tightened the mechanisms slowly, applying steady pressure. The rhythmic tightening, accompanied by the soft creak of wood, was a familiar sound, a signal that the garment's transformation was nearing completion. For the workers, these moments held quiet satisfaction. A toga that had arrived days earlier, stained and heavy with grime, now gleamed in the afternoon light, its whiteness restored, its fabric smooth and supple. Holding it up, watching it catch the sun, was a reward in itself, a tangible proof that their labor had made something whole again. These were the fruits of toil, visible and undeniable, the kind of accomplishment that sustained them through the day's challenges. The afternoon pace was gentler than the demanding midday hours. The heat eased with the sun's arc, and the workers, having pushed through fatigue, found a second wind. Conversation blossomed, laughter rippled softly through the courtyard, and the bustle of morning gave way to a more relaxed, purposeful energy. New garments continued to arrive, but those too late in the day were carefully logged and set aside, their processing reserved for the next morning. There was an end point to the day's labor, a boundary that gave structure and meaning. This sense of completion was vital. It marked a day well spent, a cycle fulfilled. In a world where labor was grueling and often thankless, the finishing of a garment was a moment of pride. Whether slave or freedman, the workers recognized that each clean, pressed piece reflected their skill and effort. It wasn't just about survival, it was about mastery, craft, and the quiet dignity of work done well. The best moment of any day, pulling a toga from the press, holding it up, seeing it catch the afternoon light, white as clouds, smooth as water, perfect. As the afternoon waned, the Fullonica's energy softened further. The day's work was winding down, but preparation for the coming night was already underway. The rhythm of labor approached its close, and soon the quiet of evening would settle over the courtyard, ushering in rest before the cycle began anew. As the sun began its slow descent behind the hills surrounding Pompeii, the Fullonica's courtyard shifted from the frenetic energy of daytime labor to a more measured, deliberate calm. The last garments were given their final rinses, the water swirling one last time to wash away residual dirt and cleaning agents. Wet fabrics were carefully hung to dry overnight, stretched taut across ropes or laid flat in shaded corners, ready to catch the cooler night air. The wooden presses, still warm from hours of use, were checked and tightened, holding garments firmly in place to maintain their shape until morning. Workers moved with slower steps now, their movements deliberate and unhurried. The splash and clatter of earlier hours faded, replaced by softer sounds. The gentle drip of water from soaking fabrics, The quiet scraping of wooden tools being cleaned, the occasional murmur of tired voices. Tanks were drained, the murky wastewater channeled into Pompeii's intricate drainage system, disappearing beneath the city's streets. Basins were scrubbed clean, tools rinsed and arranged neatly for the next day's work. Every corner of the courtyard was swept and tidied, restoring order after the day's chaos. Despite the irony, the men who had spent the day immersed in urine and clay solutions were themselves filthy. Now they washed away the grime, scrubbing skin raw to remove the lingering smell and dirt. Cool water soothed aching muscles and pruned hands and feet, bringing a small measure of comfort after the day's toil. The psychological shift was as profound as the physical. Exhaustion settled deep in bones and sinew, but it was accompanied by relief, the satisfaction of a day survived, of work accomplished. Thoughts turned to evening meals, to rest, and to the simple pleasures of being done. Some workers retreated to modest quarters within or adjacent to the Fullonica, where they would sleep in whatever comfort was available. Others joined the flow of Pompeii's streets, moving homeward among fellow labourers, their footsteps echoing softly as the city began to quiet. Meanwhile, Stephanus or the foreman conducted their final rounds. They ensured that valuable garments were securely stored, that tools were accounted for, and that the workspace was locked tight. Tomorrow's work schedule was reviewed, a silent promise that the cycle would begin anew with dawn. The heavy wooden doors closed with a familiar resonant thud. The bar dropped into place, sealing the Fullonica against the coming night. The last sound each evening was always the same. The heavy wooden doors closing, the bar dropping into place, then silence, the Fullonica settling into the darkness like an exhausted body finally allowed to rest. Another day had ended, another day's labour completed, and though the workers would rise again with the sun, for now there was rest. The 24th of August 79 AD began like thousands of mornings before it in Pompeii. At the Fullonica of Stephanus, the day's rhythm unfolded as it always did. The first worker arrived in the pre-dawn stillness, pushing open the heavy wooden doors and stepping into the familiar coolness of the courtyard. Inside, the space waited, silent and unremarkable, ready for another day of labour. Nothing about the morning suggested it would be the last. By sunrise, more workers had trickled in, their voices breaking the quiet as they exchanged greetings. The August heat was already palpable, promising a stifling afternoon, and perhaps someone made a passing complaint about the weather, yet no one lingered on it long. There was work to do. Garments awaited cleaning. Customers had made their usual demands, and the routine called. Fires were lit, vats stirred, and the courtyard filled with the familiar sounds of treading, splashing, and low conversation. It was a morning of ordinary details, the kind that would later become extraordinary in their preservation. A worker carefully arranged a toga in a wooden press, tightening it for what he thought would be an overnight shaping. Fresh urine was delivered in amphoras, lined neatly along the courtyard edge, waiting to be poured into treading tanks. Conversations drifted through the air, mundane matters about upcoming festivals, complaints about a particularly demanding customer, speculation about the latest neighborhood gossip. These were the small, forgettable moments of daily life, moments that no one thought to remember because they seemed so unremarkable. At some point that morning, perhaps around 9 a.m. or 10, the ground began to tremble faintly. Mount Vesuvius, looming 6 miles to the north, had started to stir, but the movements were subtle at first, nothing that would have alarmed the Fullers. Earthquakes weren't uncommon in the region, and minor tremors were often ignored as part of life in Campania. If anyone noticed, they might have paused briefly, exchanged a glance or a shrug, and returned to their work. The Fullonica-s activity continued undisturbed. Tools were laid out in their usual places, garments moved through their stages of cleaning, and the pressing mechanisms groaned as they tightened fabric into perfect folds. Archaeologists would later find these tools exactly where the workers had left them, as if they had only stepped away for a moment, intending to return. A treading vat held water and solution, ready for the next garment but never used. A half-folded tunic lay abandoned, its story frozen mid-action. It was a morning of ordinariness, and that ordinariness is precisely what makes it so poignant in retrospect. The workers of the Fullonica were simply doing their jobs, making their livings, living their lives. They had no premonitions, no warnings that this day was different from the thousands that came before it. They worked with the steady focus of men who knew their trade and trusted in tomorrow. At some point that morning, maybe 9 a.m., maybe 10, Mount Vesuvius, 6 miles away, began showing unusual activity. Probably no one at the Fullonica noticed at first. They were busy working. As the morning wore on, the ordinariness of the day would begin to fracture. Around midday, the eruption would begin in earnest, and even the focused workers of the Fullonica, 6 miles away, would have no choice but to notice. The ground shaking, the strange dark cloud rising into the sky, the earthquakes growing more violent. Around midday on the 24th of August, 79 AD, Pompeii's ordinary day began to fracture. At approximately 1 p.m., Mount Vesuvius erupted with a force unlike anything the region had known in living memory. From the Fullonica, 6 miles away, the workers would have first noticed something unusual in the sky. What had been a bright, cloudless day began to change as an enormous column of ash, gas, and rock rose from the mountain's summit, shooting miles into the stratosphere. The column spread at its peak, flattening like the canopy of an umbrella pine, the characteristic shape of a Plinian eruption. At first, the sight may have drawn curiosity rather than alarm. Volcanic activity wasn't unfamiliar in the region, and Vesuvius, though looming, had been quiet for centuries. Some workers in the Fullonica might have paused to glance upward, shading their eyes against the midday sun, murmuring observations or speculating about the strange cloud. Life continued in the city. Merchants remained at their stalls, children played in the streets, and labourers carried on with their tasks. The fullers, surrounded by their treading vats and drying garments, likely returned to their work, assuming the phenomenon would pass. But within an hour, the situation began to change. Pumice, small, light fragments of volcanic rock, started falling from the sky. At first, the pieces were scattered and infrequent, bouncing harmlessly off rooftops and stones. Yet the fall quickly intensified. The workers in the courtyard would have felt the strange tick of pumice striking their shoulders and heads, light but persistent. Some may have looked up again, seeing the sky darken unnaturally as ash thickened the air. The decision-making at this stage was fraught. Should the workers continue with their tasks, trusting that the eruption was a temporary disturbance? Should they shelter within the building, or should they leave the Fullonica altogether? Across Pompeii, people faced the same questions. Many chose to stay, seeking safety indoors, believing this would soon pass. Habit is a powerful force, and normalcy bias. The human tendency to assume everything will remain as it has always been, likely played a role. For fullers, there may have been an added pressure to finish the day's work to meet customer expectations. Even as pumice began to accumulate in the courtyard, by mid-afternoon, the situation grew more dire. Pumice continued to rain down, now in larger quantities, piling up on rooftops and streets. The sounds of the eruption were punctuated by the groans and cracks of buildings succumbing to the weight above them. Earthquakes rattled the ground intermittently, causing roof tiles to fall and walls to shift. Dust and ash filled the air, making it harder to breathe and see. The workers in the Fullonica must have gathered in the courtyard, looking up at the darkening sky, feeling the strange, disorienting sensation of midday turned to twilight. Some Pompeians, realizing the danger, began to flee at this stage. They grabbed what they could carry, valuables, food, children, and hurried toward the gates of the city. Others, however, stayed, whether out of fear, indecision, or misplaced faith that the worst was over. They remained indoors, believing their homes would protect them. As pumice accumulated, some Pompeians held pillows over their heads for protection from falling rock. A few even tried to continue working. Habit and normalcy bias are powerful, even during catastrophe. The Fullonica workers likely made different choices, some staying, some leaving. We don't know how many remained to face what came next, but we do know their workspace would soon be buried under layers of pumice and ash. The city's fate was sealed, but the most lethal stage was still to come. The pyroclastic surges that would sweep through Pompeii, leaving no life in their wake. The final hours for Pompeii came not with a gradual decline, but with sudden, catastrophic violence. By late evening on the 24th of August, 79 AD, the city was buried under several meters of pumice and volcanic debris. The weight of the pumice had already caused many buildings to collapse, and the air was choked with ash. The people who remained, whether sheltering in their homes or trapped in the streets, were exhausted, disoriented, and desperate. Yet the worst was still to come. Around 1 a.m. on the 25th of August, the first pyroclastic surge roared down the slopes of Mount Vesuvius. Unlike the pumice fall, which was relatively slow and survivable, this was instant death. The surge was a torrent of superheated gas, pulverized rock, and ash, moving at speeds of up to 100 kilometers per h-hour. Temperatures reached an estimated 500 degrees Celsius, hot enough to incinerate organic material and vaporize soft tissues in seconds. The surge entered Pompeii like a tidal wave, flowing into streets, through doorways, and into every corner of the city. For the people in Pompeii, death was mercifully quick. The heat and gases overwhelmed them in moments. Archaeologists studying the remains have noted how the extreme heat caused bodies to contract, with skeletons assuming the curled fetal-like positions seen in plaster casts. In their final moments, some people covered their faces with their hands, a futile instinct to shield themselves. Others were frozen mid-motion, perhaps trying to escape or protect loved ones. It was a snapshot of disaster, preserved in devastating detail. The Fullonica of Stephanus was not spared. By this point, the building had already suffered from the day-long pumice fall. Roofs had likely collapsed under the accumulated weight, and the structure may have been compromised by the earthquakes that accompanied the eruption. If anyone had taken shelter in the Fullonica, they would have faced the same fate as the rest of the city's residents. The pyroclastic surge swept through the courtyard, the treading tanks, the presses, and the storage rooms, burying everything under a thick layer of ash and volcanic material. And still, the eruption continued. Multiple surges followed through the night and into the early hours of the 25th of August, each one adding new layers of destruction. By the time the eruption finally subsided later that day, Pompeii was gone. The thriving city, with its bustling streets, workshops, and homes, had been transformed into a barren field of grey ash and pumice. Nothing remained visible. The people, their possessions, their daily lives, all were buried beneath several meters of volcanic debris. In the Fullonica-esque courtyard, archaeologists eventually found the casts of human remains, people who had taken shelter there, waiting for safety that never came. Even in death, they still there, frozen forever in the 7th of August 9 AD. Where the Fullonica of Stephanus had once stood, there was now silence. Its workers, its tools, its garments mid-cleaning, all were entombed in volcanic material, preserved yet utterly destroyed. The city of Pompeii, vibrant and alive that morning, had vanished from memory. For nearly 1,700 years, it lay buried, its people forgotten, its stories untold. But the eruption that killed also preserved beneath the layers of ash. Pompeii remained frozen in time, waiting to be rediscovered. It is to this rediscovery and the extraordinary insights it has provided that we turn in the final chapter. When the eruption finally ended on the 25th of August 79 AD, Pompeii was no longer a city. It was a graveyard, buried beneath 4 to 6 meters of volcanic material. The vibrant streets, bustling workshops, crowded markets, and elegant homes were gone, entombed in ash and pumice. For those who survived, those who had fled far enough to escape the pyroclastic surges, there was little to return to. In the immediate aftermath, some survivors or opportunists came back, scavenging what they could from the tops of taller buildings that still protruded above the volcanic debris. They dug through the ash, searching for valuables, coins, jewelry, anything worth salvaging. But systematic recovery was impossible. The scale of destruction defied human effort, and the psychological weight of the disaster may have driven people away. The survivors left, and Pompeii was abandoned. Decades passed, then centuries. The exact location of Pompeii faded from memory. Within a few generations, it became a story, one of the cities destroyed by the wrath of Vesuvius long ago. By the Middle Ages, Pompeii was forgotten entirely. Farmers planted vineyards and olive groves over its buried streets, unaware of the city beneath their fields. Houses were built over ancient homes, and life continued above, oblivious to the silent world below, and yet the very force that destroyed Pompeii also preserved it. Sealed beneath the volcanic material, the city was frozen in time. The ash, rich in minerals, hardened into rock, creating an airtight seal that slowed or prevented the decay that would normally erase a city over centuries. Organic materials decomposed wood, food, human flesh, but the voids left behind by these materials remained, perfect impressions of what once was. Bodies left hollow spaces that archaeologists would later fill with plaster, recreating their forms in haunting detail. Structures, tools, and objects were preserved remarkably well, shielded from the weather, looting, and time's usual ravages. This preservation was an accident, a strange irony of history. Had Pompeii simply been abandoned, its buildings would have been looted for stone, its artifacts scattered, its streets worn away by wind and rain. Time would have eroded the city into nothing, but the violence of Vesuvius created a snapshot, a frozen moment of Roman life. The destruction, total and unyielding, ensured that Pompeii's secrets were kept safe for nearly 1,700 years. For 17 centuries, the Fullonica of Stephanus was perfectly preserved, waiting in darkness, containing the last moments of work suddenly interrupted, the ordinary made eternal by disaster. Through the fall of the Roman Empire, through the Middle Ages, through the Renaissance, Pompeii lay silent. The Fullonica of Stephanus, its vats and basins, its presses and tools, its final garments, mid-cleaning, sat in darkness. The workers, their last moments frozen in ash, lay unseen. The city, once alive with sound and movement, became a ghost, hidden beneath fields and vineyards. But silence is never permanent. In time, the fields above Pompeii would give way to discovery. The earth would be pulled back, layer by layer, and the city would emerge into light once more. And with it, the Fullonica of Stephanus, its workers, and their ordinary, extraordinary lives would return to human memory. The silence ended. The rediscovery began. In the final chapter, we explore what this remarkable preservation has taught us, not just about a Fullonica, but about the people of Pompeii and the world they left behind. For nearly 1,700 years, Pompeii lay buried and forgotten, its streets, homes, and workshops hidden beneath layers of pumice and ash. But the city's silence was finally broken in the 16th century. In the 1590s, during canal construction near the Sarno River, workers stumbled upon ancient ruins. At first, these discoveries were treated as curiosities or sources of marble and artifacts for collectors. It wasn't until 1748, under Spanish Bourbon rule, that systematic excavation began. Even then, the work was more akin to treasure hunting than archaeology, with early excavators focused on recovering artworks and valuables rather than preserving or understanding the city as a whole. By the 19th century, excavation methods began to evolve. Archaeologists came to realize that Pompeii was not just a repository of artifacts, but a time capsule, a snapshot of Roman life frozen in the moment of disaster. The Fullonica of Stephanus was uncovered during this period, in the late 1800s and early 1900s. When archaeologists entered the site, they found it remarkably intact. The treading tanks, still filled with pumice and ash, preserved their shapes and positions perfectly. The pressing equipment, though damaged, was recognizable. Painted signs and inscriptions revealed the name of the owner, Stephanus, and confirmed the building's function as a Fullonica. One of the most revolutionary developments in Pompeii's excavation came in 1863, when Giuseppe Fiorelli introduced a technique that transformed how archaeologists studied the city. Fiorelli realized that voids in the hardened volcanic material were left by organic matter that had decomposed, wooden beams, furniture, and even human bodies. By injecting plaster into these voids, he created detailed casts of people and objects, capturing their shape and position at the moment of burial. Some of these casts came from the Fullonica of Stephanus, showing individuals who had sought shelter there when the pyroclastic surges arrived. Their final moments, frozen in ash, revealed the human side of the disaster. The excavation of the Fullonica revealed not just its layout, but its story. Tools and equipment were found in situ, providing direct evidence of the industrial processes we described. Customer garments, some mid-cleaning, offered insights into the types of clothing and fabrics common in Pompeii. Painted signs advertised the services provided, while the physical evidence of interrupted work spoke to the suddenness of the disaster. Before this discovery, much of what was known about Roman fulling came from literary sources, mentions in texts by authors like Pliny the Elder. The Fullonica of Stephanus transformed that understanding, grounding it in physical reality. It became one of the most important sites for studying Roman industrial labor, offering a rare glimpse into the daily work and lives of people who were rarely immortalized in marble or myth. When archaeologists first entered the Fullonica, pumice and ash still filled the treading tanks, exactly where it had flowed 1,800 years earlier, preserving the tanks' shapes and positions perfectly. Excavation produced data, but raw data alone doesn't tell a story. What have scholars interpreted from these findings? What does the Fullonica of Stephanus teach us about Roman labor, economics, and daily life? These are the lessons we explore next. The rediscovery of the Fullonica of Stephanus provided an extraordinary window into the industrial, social, and economic life of ancient Pompeii. Before its excavation, much of what was known about Roman fulling came from literary sources. Brief mentions in texts by authors like Pliny the Elder, often dismissive or mocking in tone. The physical evidence uncovered at Stephanus's Fullonica transformed this understanding, revealing the complexity, skill, and organization behind what had once been seen as a humble trade. One of the most significant contributions of the Fullonica was its confirmation of ancient industrial processes. The preserved treading tanks, rinsing basins, and pressing equipment matched descriptions from Roman texts, but also filled in gaps those sources left. For example, chemical analysis of residues in the tanks confirmed the use of urine, fuller's earth, and sulfur, allowing modern researchers to reconstruct the actual cleaning chemistry. This revealed not just what fullers used, but how they combined materials to achieve specific results, such as removing grease or restoring whiteness to wool. The layout of the Fullonica also illuminated the social organization of labor. The division of spaces, treading tanks for physical labor, upper terraces for drying, and areas for pressing and finishing, reflected a clear workflow and hierarchy. Younger or enslaved workers likely performed the most grueling tasks, while senior workers or freedmen handled more skilled or supervisory roles. This spatial organization provided a glimpse into the daily rhythms of labor and the relationships between workers. Economically, the Fullonica offered insights into Roman commerce. Inscriptions and accounting marks on the walls provided evidence of pricing and business practices. These records showed how fullers balanced costs, materials, labor, and maintenance against the fees they charged customers. The Fullonica wasn't just a workshop, it was a business deeply integrated into Pompeii's economy and reliant on reputation and customer trust. Perhaps most poignantly, the Fullonica revealed the physical toll of labor. Worn depressions in the stone floors of the treading tanks, shaped exactly to human feet, showed how workers stood in the same positions so often that they literally wore grooves into the stone. Skeletal remains found at the site, combined with tool wear patterns, highlighted the physical demands of fulling, aching backs, calloused hands, and respiratory issues from exposure to sulfur fumes. One small detail amazed researchers: worn depressions in the treading tank floors shaped exactly to human feet, proving men stood in the same positions so often that they literally wore grooves in stone. The Fullonica of Stephanus exemplifies why Pompeii is invaluable to Roman studies. It allows us to observe not just objects, but the relationships between objects, spaces, and human activities. It corrects and enriches literary sources, showing that fulling was not just labor, but skilled, systematic work requiring expertise. Ongoing research continues to refine our understanding, as new scientific methods and questions bring fresh insights to this ancient trade. Academic knowledge is invaluable, but the Fullonica also raises deeper questions about time, memory, and the meaning of ordinary lives. These are the themes we explore in the final section. The Fullonica of Stephanus, like so much of Pompeii, preserves not the grand events of history, but the mundane reality that filled most human lives: work, survival, routine. Its workers were not emperors or senators, not poets or generals. They were ordinary men, labouring in a trade that was essential but unglamorous. And yet, through the accident of preservation, they are remembered while many of Rome's most powerful figures are forgotten. The Fullonica reminds us of the democracy of disaster. When Vesuvius erupted, it did not distinguish between the wealthy and the poor, the influential and the invisible. Everyone was buried equally, their lives interrupted in the same instant. Today, archaeologists study the tools and spaces of fullers with the same care once reserved for palaces and temples. The work of these labourers, overlooked in their own time, now instructs and fascinates millions. Visiting Pompeii, you can stand where these workers stood, see the tools they held, and observe the spaces where they spent their days. The treading tanks, the presses, the drying courtyard, they are all still there, silent but eloquent. This creates an almost supernatural connection across time. These were real people who worked, suffered, rested, laughed, worried, and hoped. The destruction that killed them has given them a kind of immortality. There is a paradox here. We can know more about a single day in a fuller's life than about years in the lives of emperors. The preservation of Pompeii captured the physical reality of labour in a way that no written record ever could. The grooves worn into the treading tank floors, the tools left mid-use, the garments abandoned mid-cleaning. These details speak volumes about the rhythms of work and the lives of those who performed it. Every time someone studies the Fullonica of Stephanus, attends a lecture, reads an article, or listens to this narrative, the workers are remembered again, pulled from obscurity by the accident that killed them. This knowledge matters. Understanding how ordinary people lived and worked tells us more about human experience than chronicles of wars and politics ever could. The fuller's labour, preserved accidentally, now serves as a testament to the dignity of work and the universality of human effort. For the workers of the Fullonica of Stephanus, life was hard, their days filled with toil, but their lives mattered, their work mattered, and now, through the preservation of their world, they are remembered, not as nameless labourers, but as individuals whose ordinary lives hold extraordinary meaning. We've come full circle from an ordinary morning to the eruption that buried Pompeii, to rediscovery, and finally to reflection. The Fullonica of Stephanus reminds us that history is not just the story of the powerful, it is the story of everyone. 2,000 years have passed since the morning when workers arrived at the Fullonica of Stephanus, unlocked its heavy wooden doors, and stepped into the rhythm of another day's labour. In that time, the world has transformed beyond anything they could have imagined. Roman civilization, which seemed eternal in 79 AD, fell. Its language evolved into new tongues. Religions rose and replaced one another. Empires rose, flourished, and collapsed. Political systems were built and dismantled. Yet beneath the vineyards of Campania, the Fullonica waited, sealed and preserved, holding the evidence of work that, in some form, has continued for centuries and will continue for centuries more. Laundry is eternal. Specific civilizations are not. In 79 AD, Rome had been the center of the known world for over 800 years. To the workers in the Fullonica, it must have seemed as though it always had been and always would be. They could not have imagined its fall. They could not have imagined a world of machines and electricity, where fulling no longer required human feet in treading tanks. And yet their work, frozen in time, now teaches us about both ancient life and the enduring continuity of human labour. The preservation of the Fullonica was an accident, an extraordinary stroke of historical luck. Most human experience vanishes without trace. Words spoken, tasks completed, lives lived and gone. The vast majority of people leave no evidence behind, their worlds dissolving into time. Yet occasionally, through some strange twist of fate, fragments are saved, a Fullonica, a set of tools, the shape of feet worn into stone. These fragments become precious, not because they were extraordinary, but because they represent the countless millions of lost moments that were just like them. The Fullonica of Stephanus reminds us that history is not just the story of emperors, senators, or great battles. It is the story of ordinary people. People who rose before dawn, worked through the heat, and earned their rest at day's end. Their labor sustained civilizations, built economies, and made life possible for everyone else. 2,000 years from now, what fragments of our civilization will survive? What ordinary workplace, preserved by accident, will teach the future about how we lived and worked? As we take the long view, the details fade into a larger picture. Civilizations rise and fall, but the rhythms of human life, work, survival, routine, continue. The Fullonica, preserved by disaster, speaks to this timeless continuity, and so we return to where we began, an ordinary morning. Workers arriving, doors opening, the sounds of labor beginning. It is a scene that could belong to any time, any place. The Fullonica reminds us that while civilizations may pass, the work of ordinary people endures. Now, the narrative ends. You've traveled through time, walked the streets of Pompeii, and seen the work of ancient hands. Let these thoughts settle gently, like ash over a city, and let sleep take you, carrying the rhythm of human history into your dreams.